In 1899, a French soldier found a stone. It was not a small stone. It was approximately 114 centimeters tall, 72 centimeters wide, and 28 centimeters thick. A slab of granodiorite, grey-black and polished, weighing roughly 760 kilograms. It had been incorporated into the walls of Fort Julian, a medieval fortification near the town of Rashid, known to Europeans as Rosetta, on the western branch of the Nile Delta. The soldier's name was Pierre-François Bouchard, and he recognized, as soon as the stone was uncovered during a construction project at the fort, that the 3 bands of text inscribed across its face were unusual. He reported the find to his superiors. The stone was transferred to the scholars accompanying Napoleon's Egyptian expedition, and within weeks, the most consequential archaeological discovery in the history of the study of the ancient world had begun its journey through the hands of scholars who would spend the next 23 years working out what it said. What it said was one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of human civilization, not because of its content. The content, once deciphered, turned out to be a priestly decree, a formal statement of honors awarded to a king, written in the administrative language of a bureaucratic state performing an institutional ritual. Not glamorous, not dramatic, not the lost gospel of some ancient religion or the secret formula of some vanished technology. A bureaucratic decree, but carved in 3 scripts simultaneously, in hieroglyphs, in Demotic, and in Greek, by priests who understood that different populations in the kingdom read different scripts, and that a document intended for maximum political reach needed to speak in every available register at once. And it was this 3-script inscription on this single grey stone that unlocked the entire hieroglyphic writing system that had been silent for more than 1400 years, that gave the modern world back the ability to read everything that ancient Egypt had ever written in the script that had been its primary medium of formal expression for 3,000 years. The stone was issued in the name of Ptolemy V Epiphanes. The decree was written by the Egyptian priests. The year was 196 BC, just over 2,200 years before Bouchard found it in the wall. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand not just who Ptolemy V was, but what the Rosetta Stone's content, that bureaucratic decree, that institutional ritual, reveals about the extraordinary crisis through which the Ptolemaic dynasty was struggling to survive, and about what it meant for a civilization to be fighting, in the 2nd century BC, for its own continued existence against internal collapse, foreign invasion, and the slow, inexorable pressure of a changed world. Let that sink in. The most famous object in the history of Egyptology, the stone that gave the modern world back the ability to read ancient Egypt, that stone was not a monument to triumph. It was a monument to desperation, the product of a regime in crisis, a boy king who had survived assassination attempts before he could walk, a priesthood trying to maintain the institutional foundations of a civilization that was fracturing under pressures from every direction. The Rosetta Stone is extraordinary, not because it records a moment of Egyptian greatness, but because it records a moment of Egyptian vulnerability, managed with the specific institutional intelligence of a priestly tradition 3,000 years deep that understood, with complete clarity, exactly what was at stake. The full story of that moment, the full story of Ptolemy V, of the priests who wrote the decree, of the crisis that produced it, and the civilization that survived it, has never been adequately told to the general public. It is the story of one of the most fascinating and most underappreciated chapters in the entire history of the ancient world. Before we get started, if you find these stories as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let's begin. The Rosetta Stone is currently in the British Museum in London. It has been there since 1802 CE, when the terms of the Treaty of Alexandria, signed after the French military surrender in Egypt, transferred it and several other significant Egyptian antiquities to British custody. It is kept in Room 4 of the Egyptian Galleries, in a specially constructed mount that allows visitors to walk around it. It is the most visited single object in the museum. More people have stood before it in the past 2 centuries than before almost any other object in the world. Most of them do not know who Ptolemy V was. Most of them do not know what crisis the stone was issued in response to. Most of them do not know that the decree it contains, translated, is a record of political terror barely concealed beneath institutional language. The announcement of honors for a child king who had come to power through murder, issued by priests who were trying to hold a fracturing civilization together with the only tools they had, which were words and ritual and the ancient weight of 3,000 years of tradition. This account gives that stone back its full context, and in that context, the most famous object in the history of Egyptology becomes something far more extraordinary than a code-breaking puzzle. It becomes a window into the moment when the ancient world began to end. The window is open. The story begins. To understand Ptolemy V and the world the Rosetta Stone emerged from, you need to understand what had happened to the dynasty between the founding vision of Ptolemy I and the crisis of Ptolemy V, because the trajectory of the Ptolemaic dynasty between those two rulers is one of the most instructive stories in the entire history of the ancient world. A story about how the most carefully built institutions can be eroded from the inside, about how the most favorable circumstances can be squandered by the wrong combinations of personality and politics, and about how the specific human qualities that build great things are not reliably transmitted to the people who inherit them. Ptolemy I had built the most stable of the Diadochi kingdoms on the foundations of Egypt's extraordinary natural productivity and the specific institutional intelligence of a man who had spent a lifetime learning how power actually worked. Ptolemy II had developed that foundation into the most commercially and intellectually active civilization of the Hellenistic world. The library, the Pharos, the Septuagint, the Red Sea trade, the Great Procession, the specific synthesis of Greek and Egyptian traditions that made Alexandria irreplaceable. Ptolemy III Euergetes had maintained much of this vision. He was a competent ruler and a genuine intellectual patron, and the early Ptolemaic dynasty's cultural program continued to function at a high level under his reign. Then came Ptolemy IV. Ptolemy IV Philopator, the Father Louver, a title whose irony was noted even by ancient observers, since he was very probably complicit in or directly responsible for his own father's death, ruled Egypt from approximately 221 to 204 BC. His reign was a turning point in the dynasty's history, and not in the direction of any of the preceding rulers. Ptolemy IV was, by the consistent assessment of the ancient sources, a ruler of negligible political intelligence and entirely misplaced personal priorities. He was interested in religion, specifically in the mystery cults of Dionysus, to which he was devoted with an intensity that ancient observers found both striking and politically alarming. He was interested in theatrical spectacle and in the company of certain specific court advisors, most prominently the brothers Agathocles and Agathoclea, who exercised over the king an influence that the ancient sources describe with barely concealed disgust. He was not interested in governance, in diplomacy, in the management of the military, or in the systematic maintenance of the administrative apparatus that his predecessors had built. The consequence of this disengagement was a progressive degradation of the institutional health of the Ptolemaic state that was not immediately visible in a single catastrophic event, but was cumulative and structural. The administrative apparatus continued to function because it had enough institutional momentum to keep functioning without active royal direction. The commercial networks continued to operate. The library and the museum continued to exist, but the specific royal attention and royal investment that had sustained the early Ptolemaic cultural program at its highest level was withdrawn, and the specific calibration of policies and priorities that had made the early Ptolemaic state extraordinary was allowed to drift. More concretely, the military, which had been one of the most important instruments of the early Ptolemaic state's diplomatic position, was allowed to deteriorate in its traditional Greek mercenary composition. Ptolemy IV's court advisors, facing a major external military threat from the Seleucid king Antiochus III, made a fateful decision to arm and train native Egyptian soldiers for the Battle of Raphia in 217 BC, the decisive engagement of the Fourth Syrian War, in which Ptolemy IV defeated Antiochus's invasion force and secured the Ptolemaic hold on Coeli Syria. The Battle of Raphia is one of the most significant events in the history of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and its significance is almost entirely about the unintended consequences of the victory rather than the victory itself. Ptolemy IV won, Antiochus retreated, Coeli Syria remained Ptolemaic, but the native Egyptian soldiers who had fought at Raphia, trained, armed, organized, and proven in battle, returned to Egypt with a new understanding of their own military capability. The native Egyptian population had been kept systematically disarmed by the Ptolemaic state's reliance on Greek mercenaries, a policy whose logic was both commercial, since mercenaries are loyal to whoever pays them, and political, since an unarmed native population is an easier population to govern. Raphia changed this. The Egyptian soldiers who came home from Raphia were soldiers, and they knew it. Within a few years of Raphia, the first major native Egyptian revolts of the Ptolemaic period began. They started in the Delta, spread to Upper Egypt, and eventually produced, in the territory around Thebes and the surrounding region, a series of native Egyptian counter-pharaohs, rulers recognized by the local population, supported by the native priesthood, and capable of maintaining something approaching governmental authority over significant portions of Upper Egypt for extended periods. The longest-lasting of these native Egyptian counter-kingdoms persisted for approximately 20 years in the late 3rd and early 2nd centuries BC. The numbers are striking. For roughly 20 years, the Ptolemaic state effectively controlled only the delta and the larger cities of the Nile Valley, while native Egyptian rebels controlled much of Upper Egypt. This was not simply a military challenge. It was a crisis of legitimacy, a demonstration that the specific accommodation between the Greek ruling class and the native Egyptian population, which had been the political foundation of the Ptolemaic state since its founding, had broken down in a specific and serious way. Ptolemy IV died in 204 BC. The exact circumstances of his death are not entirely clear from the surviving sources, but what is clear is that the court of Agathocles and Agathoclea managed the information of his death, concealing it for a period to allow themselves to position their faction for the succession. The heir to the throne was Ptolemy V, who was, at the time of his father's death, approximately 5 years old. 5 years old. The heir to the most commercially important kingdom in the Eastern Mediterranean. The ruler of the civilization that maintained the Library of Alexandria, the pharaoh who was supposed to be the embodiment of divine order on earth, the living Horus who sustained the cosmic machinery of the universe. 5 years old. What followed was one of the more brutal episodes in the history of a dynasty that had already produced some genuinely brutal episodes. Agathocles and Agathoclea, having announced the death of Ptolemy IV and placed themselves in effective control of the regency for the child king, proceeded to remove every potential rival with the systematic thoroughness of people who understood that their position depended on the absence of alternatives. The king's mother, Arsinoe III, the child's actual parent, was killed, according to the ancient sources, almost immediately. The ancient writer Polybius, who is the primary source for this period, and who had access to oral testimonies from people close to the events, describes the murder with a specificity that suggests reliable information rather than generic court politics gossip. The court of Agathocles controlled Egypt for approximately 4 years, from 204 to 200 BC. During those 4 years, the native revolts in Upper Egypt intensified, the administrative machinery deteriorated further, and the external position of the Ptolemaic kingdom weakened in ways that were immediately exploited by the two major external powers, who had been watching the chaos with interest. Antiochus III of the Seleucid kingdom to the northeast, and Philip V of Macedon to the northwest. Antiochus and Philip made a treaty, or at least engaged in discussions that the ancient sources interpret as treaty-like, to divide the Ptolemaic Empire between them, while the child king was too young and too controlled by his regents to resist. The specific terms of this arrangement if it was indeed a formal treaty rather than a tacit understanding, are disputed by modern scholars. What is not disputed is that Antiochus launched a major invasion of Coeli Syria, the territory that Ptolemy IV had defended at Raphia, and successfully took it. The Fifth Syrian War, from 202 to 195 BC, ended with Antiochus establishing Seleucid control over Palestine and much of the Levantine coast. The Ptolemaic Empire lost the territory that had been one of its most important strategic and commercial assets for the previous century. This was the world into which Ptolemy V came of age, a dynasty in crisis, an empire contracting, a native population in revolt, the administrative apparatus of the state degraded by a decade of negligent and then predatory court management, and a child king whose survival depended on the loyalty of people, whose loyalty was contingent on their own calculations of advantage. The specific turning point that ended the regency of Agathocles came in approximately 200 BC, when the Alexandrian mob, the population of the most important city in the kingdom, always a significant political force in the Ptolemaic state, rose against the regents. Polybius describes the events in detail that is almost cinematically vivid, the crowd assembling, the soldiers joining the crowd, Agathocles and Agathoclea and their associates being dragged through the streets of Alexandria, and the specifically described manner of their killing, which Polybius records with the particular frankness that distinguishes his historical writing from the more sanitized accounts of later authors. Agathocles and Agathoclea were killed by the mob. Their associates were killed by the mob. Ptolemy V, now approximately 9 years old, was carried through the streets by the crowd in a spontaneous celebration of liberation from the regency. A new set of advisors took control, and the crisis continued, because the specific problems that the regency had presided over, the native revolts, the Seleucid military advance, the deteriorated administrative apparatus, the broken accommodation between the Greek ruling class and the native Egyptian population, did not end with the mob violence that killed the regents. These were structural problems. They required structural solutions. The priests understood this. They understood it with the clarity of an institution that had been thinking about the relationship between royal authority and native Egyptian loyalty for 3,000 years. And in 196 BC, when Ptolemy V was approximately 14 years old, and the coronation ceremony at Memphis was being organized, they acted. They wrote the decree that became the Rosetta Stone, and they wrote it in 3 scripts for 3 audiences, because they understood that the specific crisis of the Ptolemaic state required the specific solution of speaking to every available constituency simultaneously, in their own language, in their own script, in the specific cultural register that would be most effective for each. The modern scholar who has done the most accessible and the most rigorous analysis of the Rosetta Stone's content as a historical document, as a text that tells us something specific about the crisis it was produced in response to, is the British Egyptologist John Ray, who wrote the most widely read modern account of the Rosetta Stone's history and significance in 2007 CE. Ray noted that readers who encounter the stone in the British Museum tend to focus on the decipherment story rather than on the content, and that this focus, while understandable, given the decipherment's extraordinary intellectual achievement, has the effect of making the stone seem primarily about modern scholarship rather than about the ancient world that produced it. The stone is about the ancient world. The content matters. And the content, read carefully in the context of the crisis that produced it, is among the most illuminating documents in the entire corpus of Ptolemaic evidence. That content and that context is what this account now examines. The specific mechanics of the crisis that produced the Rosetta Stone require more detailed examination because the popular understanding of the stone tends to treat its content as essentially routine, a piece of administrative boilerplate, whose importance is entirely about the 3 scripts rather than about what the 3 scripts say. This understanding is incorrect, and the corrective requires understanding the specific historical moment of 196 BC with more precision. The Memphis Decree, the text that the Rosetta Stone carries, was issued at a priestly council held at Memphis in March of 196 BC to celebrate the first anniversary of Ptolemy V's coronation. Ptolemy V had been crowned pharaoh at Memphis in approximately 197 BC in the traditional Egyptian coronation ceremony that the Ptolemaic dynasty had maintained from its founding as one of the primary mechanisms of its legitimacy with the native Egyptian population. But the coronation itself, the performance of the ancient ritual, the recognition by the Memphis priesthood, the bestowal of the royal titulary, had not resolved the native revolts in Upper Egypt. Those revolts were still ongoing. The rebel counter-pharaohs in the Theban region were still operating. The Seleucid forces were still in Coele Syria. The administrative system was still degraded. The crisis was not over. The Memphis Decree was an attempt to address the crisis through the specific instrument that the Egyptian priestly tradition had always used to manage the relationship between the royal authority and the native population, the formal statement of reciprocal obligations. The priests at Memphis were not simply congratulating Ptolemy V on his first, they were, in the specific language of the decree, itemizing the specific benefits that the king had conferred on the temples and the temple establishments, and in return, conferring on the king the specific forms of honor and divine recognition that the priestly tradition had the authority to bestow. The specific benefits itemized in the decree are extraordinarily revealing when read as a historical document rather than as a piece of ritual boilerplate. The decree lists the following: remission of taxes on the temples, restoration of certain temple revenues that had been diverted during the period of the regency, release of prisoners taken during the suppression of the native revolts, specific grants of land and resources to individual temples, and a series of specific ritual honors that the king had performed or was committing to perform for the major Egyptian cult centers. Read these items carefully. The remission of taxes on the temples means that the temples had been taxed in ways that violated the traditional exemptions that the Regency government had, in its financial desperation, reached into the institutional resources of the temple establishments in ways that the native Egyptian population understood as a fundamental violation of the terms of the Ptolemaic priestly accommodation. The restoration of diverted temple revenues means the same thing, in more detail. The release of prisoners means that the suppression of the native revolts had included the imprisonment of specific individuals, almost certainly including priests and other members of the native Egyptian elite whose release was being announced as a gesture of reconciliation. This is not the decree of a secure government celebrating its achievements. It is the decree of a government trying to rebuild the accommodation that the previous decade had destroyed, trying to demonstrate, through the specific institutional language of the priestly tradition, that the king understood what his obligations were and intended to fulfill them. The math is striking. Every benefit listed in the decree is a reversal of a specific harm that the Regency government had done to the temple establishments and the native Egyptian population. Every honor bestowed on the king in return is a piece of legitimacy that the priests were in a position to give or withhold. The decree was a negotiation conducted in ritual language between a government in crisis and the institutional tradition, without whose cooperation the government could not function. The British scholar Dorothy Thompson, whose monograph on Memphis under the Ptolemies is the most comprehensive modern study of the city during this period, described the Memphis Decree as one of the most important documents for understanding the specific character of the Egyptian priestly tradition's relationship to the Ptolemaic state. Thompson noted that the decree was not an isolated event, but the most visible surviving example of a practice. The formal statement of royal obligations to the temples, issued in the context of specific royal ceremonies that had been ongoing throughout the Ptolemaic period, and that reflected the continuous management of the priestly royal accommodation that was the political foundation of the dynasty's legitimacy. What was specific about the Rosetta Stone's version of this practice was the crisis that had preceded it. Previous versions of these decrees, the Canopus Decree of 238 BC, issued under Ptolemy III, is the most important comparative example, had been issued in contexts of relative stability, as the formal expression of an accommodation that was already functional. The Memphis Decree of 196 BC was issued in a context of acute crisis, as an attempt to rebuild an accommodation that had been seriously damaged. The specific content of the two decrees reflects this difference. The Canopus Decree is more expansive, more confident, more concerned with celebrating the dynasty's achievements. The Memphis Decree is more specific about particular grievances and particular redresses, more explicitly focused on the transactional relationship between what the king gives and what the priests give in return. This transactional quality is what makes the Rosetta Stone so extraordinary as a historical document. It is not a piece of royal propaganda in the simple sense of a ruler broadcasting his own greatness. It is a record of a deal, a specific, negotiated deal between the rulers of a stressed Hellenistic kingdom and the institutional representatives of 3,000 years of Egyptian religious tradition, conducted in the formal language of the ancient priestly ceremony, inscribed in 3 scripts to reach the widest possible audience, and distributed to every major temple in Egypt to be displayed in the most public location available. The distribution is itself significant. The Rosetta Stone is not unique. At least 3 other copies of the same decree have been found in Egypt, fragments of similar stones, bearing the same text in the same 3 scripts from other temple sites across the country. The Memphis Decree was a document designed for maximum reach, issued in multiple copies, placed in multiple locations, and inscribed in multiple scripts, precisely because its producers understood that the political effectiveness of the accommodation it represented depended on it being known to the Greek-speaking administrative class in their own script, known to the demotic reading native Egyptian population in their own script, and displayed in hieroglyphs at the temple entrances where the ancient divine authority of the tradition resided. The Rosetta Stone was a piece of political communication designed for maximum impact across a divided and stressed society. And it was the product of a specific moment in history, a specific crisis, a specific negotiation, a specific attempt to rebuild a broken accommodation, that the stone's subsequent history has almost completely obscured. The subsequent history is the decipherment, and the decipherment is extraordinary, but it has cast a shadow over the stone's original meaning that this account is attempting to illuminate. The shadow lifts in the following sections, as the full context of Ptolemy V's reign is examined in the detail it deserves. The wider world that surrounded the Ptolemaic kingdom in the 2nd century BC was itself in transformation of a kind that was reshaping the political geography of the ancient Mediterranean in ways that Egypt, for all its residual commercial importance, could not ignore. Rome was rising. The Roman Republic in the late 3rd and early 2nd century BC was in the process of the specific military and political expansion that would eventually produce the Roman Empire. The absorption of Macedon, the defeat of the Seleucid kingdom's western ambitions, the establishment of Roman hegemony across the entire Mediterranean basin. Rome had fought and won the Second Punic War against Carthage between 218 and 201 BC, a conflict of extraordinary ferocity that had transformed the Roman military into the most effective fighting force in the ancient Mediterranean. Rome had then turned eastward, and the specific events of the early 2nd century BC, the defeat of Philip V of Macedon at the Battle of Cynoscephalae in 197 BC, and the defeat of Antiochus III of the Seleucid kingdom at the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BC, had established Rome as the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean in ways that the Ptolemaic court was watching with acute attention. Ptolemy V's advisors were among those watching. The strategic calculation of the mid-2nd century Ptolemaic court was shaped by the recognition that Rome was now the most important power in the Mediterranean world, more important, in the specific way that military potential determined political leverage, than either the Seleucid kingdom or what remained of Macedonian power. The specific Ptolemaic response to this recognition, the cultivation of a diplomatic relationship with Rome that would give the kingdom a degree of protection against its more immediately threatening neighbours was one of the most consequential diplomatic decisions of Ptolemy V's reign. The Roman Senate's formal recognition of Ptolemy V as the legitimate ruler of Egypt, a recognition extended in the early years of his reign when the kingdom was at its most vulnerable and the regency government was most desperate for external legitimacy, was a significant piece of diplomatic currency. It meant that any direct attack on the Ptolemaic kingdom by either the Seleucid or Macedonian kingdoms would risk Roman displeasure. It meant that the specific territorial losses that the kingdom had suffered, the loss of Coeli Syria to Antiochus, while painful, did not translate into an existential threat, because Rome was not going to allow either of the major Hellenistic kingdoms to absorb Egypt. The Roman protective umbrella over the Ptolemaic kingdom was not, in the 2nd century BC, explicit or formal in the way that modern alliances are explicit and formal. But it was real, and it was understood by all parties to be real, and it shaped the behaviour of the Ptolemaic kingdom's potential attackers in ways that were as important as any military capability that the Ptolemaic state itself could have deployed. Understanding the Roman dimension of Ptolemy V's strategic environment is essential for understanding why the Rosetta Stone was possible, why the specific accommodation with the native Egyptian priestly tradition that the decree represents was politically viable rather than simply desirable. The kingdom was not going to be militarily destroyed by its external enemies. The Roman connection provided a basic level of external security that gave the Ptolemaic court the time and the space to work on the internal problems, the native revolts, the degraded administration, the broken accommodation that the regency years had created. The specific way in which Ptolemy V and his advisors used that time and space is the story of the Memphis Decree and everything that surrounded it. It is a story of genuine political intelligence operating under severe constraints, using the specific tools available: the ancient institution of the priestly accommodation, the 3-script inscription, the distribution across every major temple, the public ceremonial of the coronation and its aftermath, to do something that no purely military or administrative solution could accomplish: rebuild the trust of the native Egyptian population in a dynasty that had badly damaged that trust across the preceding decade. Whether the rebuilding succeeded, whether the Memphis Decree and the policies it reflected actually restored the priestly royal accommodation to something like its earlier functional state, is a question that the subsequent history of the dynasty, examined carefully, allows at least a partial answer to. The native revolts in Upper Egypt did eventually end. The counter-pharaohs in the Theban region were eventually suppressed, the last of them around 186 BC, in the 8th year of Ptolemy V's effective personal reign. The administrative apparatus was gradually restored to something approaching functionality. The kingdom survived. It did not recover the commercial and diplomatic position that the early Ptolemies had built. It did not recover Coeli Syria. It did not recover the specific vitality of the library and the museum at their greatest. The high point of the Ptolemaic civilization was behind it, and the subsequent trajectory of the dynasty, the progressive shrinkage of its effective territory, the progressive degradation of its administrative and military capacity, the progressive dependence on Roman protection for its survival, was, with occasional exceptions, downward. But it survived, and the survival was, in significant part, a product of the specific institutional intelligence that produced the Memphis Decree, the priestly tradition's understanding of how to rebuild accommodation with royal authority, and the royal government's willingness, in the specific crisis of 196 BC, to accept the terms that the tradition was offering. This is the foundation, this is the context. The scale of the crisis and the specific response to it will be examined in full in the sections that follow. The core problem of Ptolemy V's reign was not, in the end, military or diplomatic, though the military and diplomatic dimensions were real and serious. The core problem was the specific fracture in the social contract of the Ptolemaic state. The breakdown of the specific accommodation between the Greek ruling class and the native Egyptian population that had been the political foundation of the dynasty from its founding. To understand the depth of this fracture, you need to understand what the accommodation had been when it was functioning. The Ptolemaic state was, from its founding by Ptolemy I, a state of two populations. The Greek-speaking population, arriving continuously as immigrants from the Macedonian homeland, from the Greek cities of the Aegean, from the other parts of the Hellenistic world, occupied the cities, staffed the administrative apparatus, commanded the military units, engaged in the commercial activities of the Mediterranean-oriented economy, and constituted the primary social world of the royal court and the intellectual community of Alexandria. They were the politically dominant class, the economically active class, and the culturally visible class. They built the library, they wrote the papyri, they left the most abundant documentary evidence. The native Egyptian population, the farmers of the Nile Valley, the craftsmen of the towns, the priests of the temple establishments, the village communities organized according to customs and legal traditions that stretched back 3,000 years, was the majority population, the agricultural population, the population whose labor produced the surplus that funded everything the Ptolemaic state built. They were less visible in the documentary record, because their documentary record was in Demotic rather than Greek, and Demotic has been studied less intensively and less continuously than Greek in the modern scholarly tradition. But they were the foundation, the extraordinary agricultural productivity of the Nile Valley, the productivity that had made Egypt the wealthiest territory in the ancient world, and that had funded the library and the Pharaohs, and the commercial empire was the product of their labor, organized through institutions and managed through knowledge systems that had been developed by their predecessors across 3,000 years of continuous agricultural civilization. The Greek administrative apparatus that the Ptolemaic state built on top of this foundation was sophisticated and innovative, but it was built on top. The foundation was Egyptian, the accommodation that the early Ptolemaic rulers had built, the specific institutional arrangement through which the Greek ruling class and the native Egyptian population coexisted in functional relationship, was based on a set of mutual obligations that the priestly tradition understood more clearly than any other institution in the kingdom. The priests were the institutional interface between the two populations. They managed the religious and administrative life of the native population. They maintained the ancient traditions that gave native Egyptian identity, its depth and its durability. They spoke, in formal contexts, for the native population's interests to the royal authority, and in return, they required specific things from the royal authority: the maintenance of the temple privileges, the protection of the temple revenues, the performance of the pharaonic ritual obligations that connected the ruler to the divine framework that the ancient tradition had always required. When this accommodation functioned, as it had functioned, with varying degrees of success, for most of the first century of Ptolemaic rule, it produced a stable polity. The native population was not content in the modern political sense of the word, but it was stable, organized, productive, and not organizing resistance. The priestly tradition managed the population's grievances, channeled its aspirations into the religious and ritual framework of the ancient tradition, and maintained the basic social order that the agricultural economy required. When the accommodation broke down, as it had broken down under the negligence of Ptolemy IV and the predation of the regency of Agathocles, the result was the native revolts that had been burning through Upper Egypt since the late reign of Ptolemy IV. And here is what made the breakdown so serious and so difficult to reverse. The accommodation was not simply a political arrangement that could be restored by a change of policies. It was a social relationship, a relationship built on trust, on the specific expectation that the royal authority would fulfill its ancient obligations, and on the specific institutional mechanisms through which that expectation was maintained and renewed. Trust, once broken, requires specific acts to rebuild it. Those specific acts require the recognition by the authority that broke it of what specifically was broken and what specific remedies are required. The Memphis Decree was exactly that recognition, the formal, institutional, publicly distributed acknowledgement by the royal government of the specific things that had been broken and the specific things that would be done to rebuild them. But here's the problem, and it gets worse. The specific acts described in the Memphis Decree, the tax remissions, the restoration of diverted revenues, the release of prisoners, were expensive. They required the Ptolemaic government to give up revenue that it needed at a time when the kingdom was under significant financial pressure from the military campaigns required to suppress the revolts and to manage the Seleucid threat. The government that was trying to rebuild the accommodation was also the government that was dealing with the structural financial consequences of the regency's mismanagement, the costs of the ongoing military campaigns in Upper Egypt, and the loss of the commercial revenues from Coele, Syria. The accommodation had to be rebuilt under conditions that made it expensive to rebuild. This is the specific dynamic that made the crisis of Ptolemy V's reign so difficult and so revealing. The very actions required to restore stability were actions that added to the financial strain that had produced the instability in the first place. The priests were asking for things that the government could only partially afford to give, and the partial giving was visible to the priests and to the native population in ways that made the restoration of trust a slower and more uncertain process than the formal language of the Memphis Decree implied. The native revolts in Upper Egypt are the clearest evidence of this dynamic. The Theban area and the surrounding region of Upper Egypt were the heartland of native Egyptian civilization. The location of Karnak and Luxor, the great temples of the New Kingdom pharaohs, the burial grounds of the ancient pharaonic tradition. The area most strongly identified with native Egyptian identity and most strongly associated with the specific memory of pharaonic sovereignty. The counter-pharaohs who established themselves in the Theban region were not simply bandits exploiting a period of weakness. They were figures who drew their legitimacy from the specific tradition of pharaonic sovereignty that the Ptolemaic state was claiming to embody but had manifestly failed to maintain. The suppression of these counter-pharaohs took approximately 20 years from the beginning of the revolts to the end. From approximately 200 BC, when the revolts began to be most serious, to approximately 186 BC, when the last effective counter-pharaoh in the Theban region was finally removed. 20 years of civil conflict in the heartland of native Egyptian civilization. 20 years of military campaigns through the Nile Valley, 20 years of institutional damage, economic disruption, and accumulated grievance on both sides. And it gets stranger. The specific mechanism by which the suppression was eventually accomplished was not primarily military. It was political. The specific realization by both the Ptolemaic government and the native Egyptian elite who had supported the revolts that a negotiated settlement served both parties' interests better than continued conflict. The terms of the various settlements that ended the revolts in different parts of Upper Egypt are not fully documented in the surviving evidence, but the pattern that emerges from the fragmentary sources suggests a consistent approach. Amnesty for participants in the revolts, restoration of temple privileges and revenues in the affected areas, confirmation of the properties and institutional status of the local temple establishments, and the integration of the surviving native elite into the administrative and religious structures of the restored Ptolemaic order. This is, at its core, a description of the Memphis Decree's logic being applied in practice across the specific territories where the revolts had occurred. The decree was the template. The settlements were the application, and the eventual success of the process, the restoration of at least functional Ptolemaic authority across the full length of the Nile Valley by approximately 186 BC, was a genuine achievement, won through the specific combination of military pressure and institutional accommodation that the crisis had required. The scholar who has done the most comprehensive modern analysis of the native revolts of the Ptolemaic period is the Belgian papyrologist Willy Claris, who, together with Dorothy Thompson and other specialists in Ptolemaic Egypt, has assembled from the scattered papyrological and epigraphic evidence the most detailed available picture of how the revolts actually functioned and how they were eventually resolved. What Claris and his colleagues found was a story considerably more complex than the simple narrative of military suppression that the ancient literary sources imply. A story of negotiation, accommodation, and the specific institutional mechanisms through which the priestly tradition managed the transition from conflict to coexistence. The Memphis Decree was not simply a product of the crisis. It was one of the instruments through which the crisis was resolved, and understanding it as such, as an instrument of political reconciliation, rather than simply as a linguistic artifact, changes the way the stone should be read. Here is what makes this truly extraordinary when you look at the full scope of what was being attempted. The priestly tradition that produced the Memphis Decree was doing something that required extraordinary institutional confidence to attempt. It was asserting, in the formal language of the ancient tradition, that the Ptolemaic king was the legitimate pharaoh of Egypt, the embodiment of divine order, the living Horus, at precisely the moment when the evidence for this claim was least convincing. The kingdom was in revolt. The administration was degraded. The king was a teenager who had survived multiple political crises before he could speak. The external position was weaker than it had been for generations. And yet the priests wrote the decree. They performed the ceremony. They distributed the stone to every major temple. They asserted the legitimacy, not as a description of reality, but as a program for creating it. The inscription was, in this reading, not a record of what was but a commitment to what should be, made public and made binding, precisely because the publicity and the binding were what the situation required. This is the specific genius of the Memphis Decree and of the priestly tradition that produced it. The assertion of legitimacy in the face of its apparent absence was not denial. It was the specific institutional act of creating the conditions for legitimacy to be rebuilt, of committing both the king and the priests, before the entire native population and the entire administrative class, to a set of mutual obligations that, once publicly stated, created the accountability mechanisms needed to actually fulfill them. The stone was a commitment device. Its 3 scripts were the guarantee that the commitment could not be unilaterally withdrawn, because every literate person in Egypt, Greek reading, Demotic reading, and the temple communities who read hieroglyphs had access to the text. The king could not simply ignore the obligations listed in the decree without all of them knowing he was ignoring them. This is political intelligence of a high order. It was the intelligence of an ancient institution that had been managing the relationship between royal authority and native population for 3,000 years, applied to a specific crisis with the full sophistication that 3,000 years of practice had developed. The Rosetta Stone is not just a linguistic artifact, it is a political artifact, and the politics it embodies are more interesting than the linguistics. The specific content of the Memphis Decree deserves a careful reading, because most people who know the Rosetta Stone as an object have never read what the stone actually says. The decipherment is famous. The content is almost unknown outside specialist circles. This is a profound imbalance that this section attempts to begin correcting. The decree opens, as such documents conventionally did, with an extended royal titulary, the 5 royal names that constituted the pharaoh's formal identity, each one a theological statement connecting the ruler to specific divine qualities and to the succession of 3,000 years of Egyptian kingship. In the specific case of Ptolemy V, these names were partly traditional and partly specific to his situation. One of his names translates roughly as, the one whom Ptah has chosen, living image of Amun, connecting him to the 2 most important divine traditions of Memphis and Thebes simultaneously, a connection that was not accidental, given that both Memphis and the Theban region were critical to the political crisis the decree was addressing. The decree then moves to a description of Ptolemy V's qualities and accomplishments, in the conventional language of pharaonic eulogy that the tradition had always employed. He is described as noble-hearted, gentle in his dealings with his subjects, strong against enemies, excellent in his judgments. These descriptions, in the ancient Egyptian tradition, are not straightforwardly biographical claims. They are theological assertions, descriptions of the qualities that the pharaoh is supposed to embody as the living Horus, assertions that the current ruler meets the traditional standard of divine kingship, regardless of whatever the specific historical circumstances might suggest about the gap between the standard and the reality. But then the decree becomes specific, and the specificity is where it becomes politically interesting. The decree lists the following benefits that Ptolemy V has conferred on the temples. He has exempted the temples from certain taxes and tax obligations. He has remitted the arrears of grain contributions that the temples owed to the royal treasury from previous years. He has restored to the temples certain revenues and properties that had been diverted or seized during the period of disorder. This is the specific reference to the Regency government's predations on the temple establishments. He has confirmed the ancient privileges of the priests, including their exemptions from certain categories of compulsory labor and military service. He has ordered the release of prisoners who had been taken during the suppression of the revolts, including specifically those who had been imprisoned in connection with the recent disturbances. He has also performed specific religious acts. He has made large donations to the major temples of gold and silver and grain, whose specific quantities the decree records with the precision of an administrative document. He has visited the important cult centers. He has performed the appropriate ceremonies. He has been properly crowned at Memphis in the full traditional form that the pharaonic tradition required. A specific point, because his coronation had initially been delayed and conducted in conditions of uncertainty, that the proper full ceremony was now formally establishing as legitimate. In return, the priests at Memphis, assembled in council, decree the following honors for Ptolemy V: a specific annual festival in his honor, to be celebrated in all the major temples of Egypt on the anniversary of his birthday and on the anniversary of his coronation, with specific ritual procedures and specific forms of observance. The installation of statues and images of Ptolemy V in all the major temples, in specific locations that connect him to the divine traditions of each cult. The addition of his image to the processional barks of the major gods so that he participates symbolically in the sacred processions that were among the most important public ceremonies of Egyptian religious life. The establishment of specific prayers in his name to be recited during major cult ceremonies, and the piece of the decree that has attracted the most modern scholarly attention, the requirement that the decree itself be inscribed in hieroglyphs, in Demotic, and in Greek, on a stele of hard stone, to be erected in every major temple in Egypt next to the statue of the permanent king. The stele of hard stone, the 3 scripts, the distribution to every major temple. These are not incidental features of the decree's formal conclusion. They are the specific mechanism through which the entire political accommodation was made binding and public. The stone was the guarantee. The scholar R.S. Simpson, in his detailed commentary on the text of the Memphis Decree, published in the 1996 edition of the British Museum's Handbook on the Rosetta Stone, noted that the 3-script requirement was not simply a practical concession to the trilingual character of the Ptolemaic population. It was a deliberate statement about the scope of the audience the decree was addressed to, a statement that the accommodation being described was intended for every literate person in Egypt, regardless of which of the 3 scripts they read, and that the royal obligation it recorded was therefore known to and verifiable by every literate person in Egypt. This is an extraordinary political act. It is the equivalent, in modern terms, of a government publishing a treaty with its own population in the most widely accessible form available. Not just in the official gazette read by bureaucrats, but on the front page of every newspaper, in the first screen of every social media platform. The specific 3-script inscription was designed to ensure that no one with the ability to read in any of the 3 major scripts of the Ptolemaic world could claim ignorance of what the king had committed to. The political intelligence of this design reflects an understanding of the specific crisis it was addressing. The native revolts had been fueled, at least in part, by the specific experience of royal promises made and not kept. The experience of a government that had been saying one thing and doing another for a decade, and that had by its behaviour broken the specific trust that the accommodation required. Inscribing the new commitment in 3 languages on hardened stone and distributing it to every major temple was the specific response to that specific breach. The creation of a record, so public, so permanent, and so widely distributed that future breach would be undeniable and future accountability inescapable. The priests understood that the written word, carved in stone and displayed in the most sacred public spaces available, carried a specific kind of binding force that oral commitments and internal administrative documents did not. The Rosetta Stone was the most effective commitment device available in the institutional toolkit of the ancient Egyptian priestly tradition. The Memphis priests used it at the specific moment when the breakdown of trust required the most powerful available instrument for rebuilding it. 3,000 years of civilizational experience distilled into a single act of political communication. 3 scripts, 1 stone, 1 attempt to hold a fracturing world together. The stone survived. The world it was trying to hold together did not survive indefinitely, but it survived long enough. The Ptolemaic dynasty continued for another 150 years after the Memphis decree, to suggest that the specific institutional intelligence that produced the decree was, in its own terms, at least partially successful. This partial success deserves the same careful attention as the dramatic crises and catastrophic failures that tend to dominate the popular narrative of the ancient world. The unglamorous, patient, institutionally sophisticated work of maintaining the social contract under conditions of acute stress is precisely the kind of governance that modern popular history most systematically undervalues. It was, nonetheless, the kind of governance that produced the Rosetta Stone, and understanding it requires understanding both the crisis that made it necessary and the specific institutional wisdom that responded to the crisis with the right tool. The right tool was the 3-script stone. The crisis was the fracture of the Ptolemaic social contract. The institutional wisdom was 3,000 years deep, and in 1899 a French soldier found the stone in a wall and gave it back to the world. The 3-script character of the Rosetta Stone, the element that made it the key to the decipherment of hieroglyphics, deserves its own careful examination here, because the linguistic dimension of the stone connects the political document to the cultural history of the Ptolemaic period in ways that illuminate both. The 3 scripts represented on the Rosetta Stone were not simply 3 different writing systems that happened to be in use simultaneously in Ptolemaic Egypt. They were 3 different cultural registers, each carrying a specific set of associations and addressing a specific audience within the complex social world of the Ptolemaic kingdom. Hieroglyphs were the sacred script, the writing system that had been associated with the divine and the monumental since the beginning of Egyptian civilization. By the 3rd century BC, hieroglyphs were no longer a practical writing system for everyday use. They had been replaced, for administrative and commercial purposes, by the increasingly cursive and abbreviated demotic script that had been developing since the Site period. But hieroglyphs retained their specific prestige as the script of the temples, the script of the divine, the script in which the relationship between the human world and the divine order was formally recorded. Inscribing the Memphis decree in hieroglyphs meant inscribing it in the most sacred available script, placing it, symbolically and literally, in the same register as the ancient divine records that covered the temple walls and columns surrounding it. Demotic was the everyday script, the script in which the native Egyptian population conducted its commercial and legal business, wrote its private letters, and produced the administrative documents of the lower levels of the Ptolemaic bureaucracy. By the time of Ptolemy V, Demotic was the primary writing system of the native Egyptian population, the script in which ordinary Egyptians were most likely to be literate. Inscribing the Memphis decree in Demotic meant reaching directly into the native population's own practical literacy, not the elevated priestly literacy of hieroglyphs, but the everyday functional literacy of people who read contracts, receipts, and administrative notices. Greek was the language of power, the administrative language of the Ptolemaic state, the commercial language of the Mediterranean economy, the scholarly language of the library and the museum. The Greek text of the Memphis Decree was directed at the Greek-speaking administrative class and at the wider Greek-speaking world of the Hellenistic Mediterranean that the Ptolemaic kingdom was embedded in. It was the text that ensured the decree was legible within the dominant administrative culture of the kingdom and within the international diplomatic community that the Ptolemaic court was constantly engaged with. The three scripts were therefore not simply three translations of the same text. They were three different modes of political communication, each designed for its specific audience, and their simultaneous inscription on a single stone was a statement that the accommodation being described was intended for all three audiences simultaneously. The king was making his commitment not just to the Greek-speaking administrators, or just to the native Egyptian population, or just to the divine tradition embodied in the hieroglyphic script. He was making it to all three simultaneously, in front of all three, in terms that all three could read. This simultaneity was itself the political message. The Ptolemaic state existed at the intersection of three cultural traditions. Its crisis had been, in significant part, a crisis of the specific accommodations that managed those intersections. The three-script stone was the statement that the accommodation was being rebuilt for all three traditions at once, in all three traditions' own terms, with the binding force of the most permanent available medium. The decipherment story is the story that most people know, but the original purpose is the story that matters. The decipherment unlocked the ability to read everything that ancient Egypt had ever written. The original purpose was to hold together a kingdom that was fracturing along the fault lines of its own complexity. Both stories are extraordinary. Both deserve to be told. In the section that follows, the decipherment story is examined in the full detail it deserves, but examined with the context that the original purpose provides, so that the unlocking of ancient Egypt's writing appears not simply as a puzzle-solving triumph, but as one of the consequences of the very institutional chaos that the Rosetta Stone was created to address. The fracturing of the ancient world was itself the reason the hieroglyphic writing system became undecipherable in the first place. The temple tradition that maintained the knowledge of how to read hieroglyphs was sustained by the Ptolemaic state's support of the priesthood. As that support diminished across the later Ptolemaic period and was replaced by Roman and then Christian administrative priorities that had no interest in maintaining the ancient script, the knowledge of how to read it contracted, became more specialized, more restricted, more dependent on an ever smaller community of practitioners. The last hieroglyphic inscription at Philae was carved in 394 CE. After that, the knowledge died. For 1400 years, the script was silent. The Rosetta Stone was carved at the moment when the priestly tradition that maintained the knowledge of hieroglyphs was still fully alive and functioning. When the three-script inscription was possible, because there were still literate priests who could write hieroglyphs with complete fluency. It was carved, in other words, at the moment just before the long decline that eventually killed the tradition. The stone that preserved hieroglyphics in a form that could eventually be compared with a known language was carved at the specific institutional moment when hieroglyphics were still a living script. If the Memphis Decree had been issued 50 years later, after the priesthood had begun its long decline, after the hieroglyphic literacy was already contracting, the three-script inscription might not have been possible. If it had been issued 50 years earlier, the Greek text would not have been available as a translation key. The specific moment, 196 BC, three scripts, hard stone, was the specific moment that preserved the key. That the key was preserved by the chaos of the late Ptolemaic period is itself an extraordinary historical irony. The same crisis that produced the decree also preserved the script. The same crisis that eventually led to the death of the hieroglyphic tradition also produced its most important surviving bilingual key. History's ironies are never simple. The Rosetta Stones is no exception. This is the core problem in its fullest form. A kingdom in crisis, a priestly tradition trying to save it with the institutional tools of 3,000 years, a stone inscribed in 3 scripts that was the product of both the crisis and the tradition. And that became, 14 centuries after the last priest who could read it died, the key to everything the ancient world had ever written. The following sections examine how. The stone was the message was the accommodation. The accommodation was the attempt to hold a fracturing world together, and the fracturing world produced, in its specific crisis, the object that would eventually give the modern world back the ability to read everything the ancient world had said. There is something almost unbearably appropriate about this. The most enduring contribution of the Ptolemaic crisis was not the recovery from the crisis. It was a stone, a grey-black stone, 114 centimeters tall, inscribed by priests who understood exactly what they were doing, distributed to temples across the Nile Valley, and incorporated eventually into a medieval wall, where it waited, in silence, for a French soldier to uncover it in 1899 and recognize that what he had found was unusual. The recognition was correct. The stone was extraordinary. The full story of why is what the remaining sections of this account tell. The recognition changed the world, but the stone existed before the recognition for 2,000 years, carrying its 3 scripts across the centuries in a form that did not require anyone to read it. The stone was patient. The knowledge was there, waiting. The world was not yet ready to receive it. And then, in the specific circumstances of Napoleon's Egyptian expedition and the scholarly competition of the early 19th century CE, the world was ready. The knowledge came back. This is the full scope of the core problem. Not just a kingdom in crisis, an entire civilization's written record, waiting in silence for 2,000 years for the specific tool that would allow the modern world to hear it again. The Rosetta Stone was that tool. Ptolemy V's crisis produced it. The Memphis priests inscribed it. And the world received it 22 centuries later in a way that the priests who carved it could never have imagined. Now the exploration begins. The exploration covers the decipherment, the crisis in full, the reign of Ptolemy V in its complete political and cultural complexity, and the specific implications of the stone story for how we understand the relationship between crisis and creation in the history of civilizations. The next section begins with the discovery story, and then tells the full story of what was discovered. The stone has been waiting to be fully understood for 2,000 years. This account makes the attempt. The attempt begins with the soldier who found it, the scholars who raced to decode it, the genius who finally did, and then goes behind all of that to the priests who made the decipherment possible, and the Pharaoh in whose name they inscribed the stone, and the world that was falling apart around them when they did. That world and that stone await. Here is what that world looked like, from the inside out. The view from the inside is the view that this account has been building toward, and the inside is where the most important part of the story lives. Chapter 1. The Soldier and the Stone, July, 1899. The French expedition in Egypt, part of Napoleon Bonaparte's ambitious campaign to establish French control over the eastern Mediterranean and threaten British interests in India, was in its 2nd year. The military campaign had not gone as planned. The British Navy under Nelson had destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile in 1798, stranding the French army in Egypt without the naval support that would have allowed it to extend its operations. But the expedition's scholarly component, the commission of scientists, scholars, and artists that Napoleon had brought along, which would produce the Description de l'Egypte, the most comprehensive modern survey of Egypt that the world had yet seen, was functioning with extraordinary productivity, recording, measuring, drawing, and analysing everything it found. At Fort Julien, near Rosetta, a French engineering officer named Pierre-François Bouchard was supervising the reinforcement of the fortification walls when his workers uncovered a large fragment of dark grey stone that had been incorporated into the medieval masonry. Bouchard recognized immediately that the stone was unusual. The bands of text visible on its face were unlike anything he had seen, and he reported the find to his superior officers. The stone was examined by the expedition's scholars, who recognized the three scripts immediately and understood, with the specific excitement of people who had been trained to look for exactly this kind of evidence, that they might have found the bilingual inscription that would allow the decipherment of hieroglyphs. Copies of the inscriptions were made. The stone was transported to Cairo in 1801, when the French military position in Egypt became untenable and the French surrendered under the terms of the Treaty of Alexandria. The stone was among the antiquities that the British insisted on transferring to their custody as a condition of the French withdrawal. It was brought to England in 1802 and deposited in the British Museum, where it has remained ever since, apart from a brief period during the First World War, when it was moved to the London Underground for safety. The British Museum received the stone with great excitement. The text of the Greek inscription, which was fully legible, was published almost immediately by the Society of Antiquaries of London. The Greek text revealed what the stone was. A decree of the Egyptian priests in honor of Ptolemy V Epiphanes, issued at the city of Memphis, listing the honors that the king had conferred on the temples and the honors that the priests were conferring on the king in return. The Greek text was comprehensible and complete. The Demotic and hieroglyphic texts were, at least partially, copies of the same decree in two other scripts. The scholarly implications were immediately grasped. If the three texts were translations of each other, if the Greek, the Demotic, and the hieroglyphic inscriptions all contained the same content, then the known Greek text could serve as a guide to the unknown Demotic and hieroglyphic texts. The proper names in the Greek text, names like Ptolemy, Alexandria, Berenice, Arxino, should appear in corresponding positions in the Demotic and hieroglyphic texts. If those positions could be identified, the specific signs used to write those names could be established. And from that starting point, the systematic comparison of signs and sounds could potentially unlock the phonetic values of the hieroglyphic and demotic writing systems. The logic was clear. The execution took 23 years. Chapter 2. The Race to Decode. The story of the decipherment of the Rosetta Stone is one of the most intellectually compelling episodes in the history of modern scholarship. A story of parallel research, competing claims, genuine brilliance on both sides of the English Channel, and the specific kind of collaborative breakthrough that occurs when multiple scholars approach the same problem from different angles and the insights of each become available to the others. The principal figures in the decipherment were the British polymath Thomas Young and the French scholar Jean-François Champollion. Between them, with contributions from several other scholars, including the Swedish diplomat and Orientalist Johann Åkerblad, who made significant early progress with the Demotic text, they broke the code within 2 decades of the stone's arrival in England. Thomas Young was, by any standard, an extraordinary intellect. Born in 1773, in Somerset, England, he had learned to read by the age of 2, was studying Hebrew and several other languages by the age of 6, and had, by the time he turned his attention to the Rosetta Stone, made fundamental contributions to physics. His wave theory of light, which he developed through the famous double-slit experiment, is one of the foundational experiments of modern physics, to medicine, to linguistics, to music theory, to the study of ancient languages, and to an extraordinary range of other fields. He was described by his contemporaries as the person who knew more than any other person alive, which is the kind of statement that tends to be hyperbole, but in Young's case was at least partially defensible. Young approached the Rosetta Stone in 1814, and within a few years had made genuine progress. He identified the royal cartouches in the hieroglyphic text, the oval rings surrounding groups of signs, which he correctly identified as enclosures containing royal names, and tentatively established the phonetic values of several hieroglyphic signs within the cartouches by comparing them with the corresponding names in the Greek text. He also made significant progress with the Demotic text, correctly identifying the Demotic signs corresponding to several Greek words. But Young made a crucial error, or rather, held on to a crucial assumption too long that prevented him from completing the decipherment. He believed that the phonetic use of hieroglyphic signs was restricted to the writing of foreign names, particularly royal names, and that Egyptian words were written differently in a non-phonetic or ideographic system. This assumption was wrong, and it was the specific intellectual obstacle that his younger French competitor would eventually overcome. Jean-François Champollion was born in 1790 in Figeac in southern France, and was from childhood possessed by a specific and consuming fascination with ancient Egypt. He had learned to read Coptic, the last form of the ancient Egyptian language, written in the Greek alphabet, still used in the liturgy of the Egyptian Christian community, as a teenager, and had spent his adult scholarly life working on the relationship between Coptic and the ancient Egyptian writing system that he was attempting to decode. The crucial insight that Champollion achieved in 1822 was the recognition that hieroglyphics were, in essence, a mixed system. Some signs were phonetic, representing sounds, while others were ideographic, representing concepts or objects directly. Both of Young's insights and his own extended work with Coptic allowed him to realize that the phonetic signs were not restricted to foreign royal names, but were used throughout the writing system, that Egyptian words in general were written phonetically, using the same kind of sign-sound correspondence that Young had tentatively identified in the royal cartouches. The specific moment of Champollion's breakthrough is one of the most famous episodes in the history of scholarship. On the 14th of September 1822, Champollion rushed into his brother's office at the Académie des Inscriptions in Paris, threw down his papers and shouted that he had found it. He then fainted. He had been working continuously for several days on the specific analytical work that had produced the breakthrough, and the combination of intellectual intensity and sleep deprivation had taken its physical toll. What he had found, what allowed him to make the announcement to the Academy a few days later that is conventionally dated as the moment the hieroglyphic code was broken, was the ability to read Egyptian words that were not proper names. He could, using the phonetic system he had established, read ordinary Egyptian words. The living language preserved in Coptic had provided the key. The sounds he had learned to associate with Coptic letters were the sounds that had been encoded thousands of years before in the hieroglyphic signs. The writing system and the spoken language it had encoded were the same language, preserved across 3,000 years in the specific institutional context of the Egyptian Christian liturgy. Chapter 3. What Champollion read? The moment when Champollion was able to read his first Egyptian words, words that were not proper names, words that meant things in a language that Coptic had allowed him to reconstruct, was the moment that 3,000 years of written Egyptian history came back to life. Not just the Rosetta Stone. Every hieroglyphic inscription on every temple wall, every papyrus document in every museum collection, every tomb inscription, every administrative record, every religious text, all of it suddenly became, in principle, legible. The scale of what was unlocked is almost impossible to convey. The ancient Egyptians were, by any standard, among the most prolific and most meticulous record keepers in the ancient world. They wrote in stone, in paint on tomb walls, on papyrus, on pottery sherds, on wood, on linen, any surface that would hold a mark. They wrote administrative records, religious texts, literary compositions, medical manuals, mathematical treatises, legal documents, personal letters, love poetry, hymns, myths, histories, geographical accounts. And all of it had been silent for 1,400 years, present but unreadable, a massive archive of human experience locked behind a script that no living person understood. Champollion's breakthrough was the key, and the key was cut, ultimately, from the specific circumstances of the Ptolemaic crisis of 196 BC, from the decision of the Memphis priests to inscribe their political accommodation with the Child King in 3 scripts on a hard stone and distribute it to every major temple in Egypt. The British scholar Andrew Robinson, in his authoritative account of the decipherment published in 2009 CE, described the Rosetta Stone as the most important archaeological discovery in the history of Egyptology, not because of what the stone itself says, but because of what it made possible. The Rosetta Stone Robinson wrote, is not important for its content, which is rather mundane. It is important for the relationship between its three texts, a relationship that provided the key to understanding a civilization that had been silent for 14 centuries. This is accurate but incomplete. The content is not mundane. The content is the record of a specific political crisis and a specific institutional response to it. The relationship between the three texts was made possible by the specific political intelligence of the priests who designed the inscription format. And the design was the product of 3,000 years of institutional wisdom about how to make political commitments binding across cultural and linguistic divides. The mundane and the extraordinary are not separate things. The decree is mundane in its administrative language and extraordinary in its political significance. The stone is mundane in its physical character, hard, grey, heavy, and extraordinary in what it preserved. The decipherment is extraordinary in its intellectual achievement and grounded in the mundane fact that a three-language inscription requires only that one of the languages be known for the comparison to begin. Everything connects. The Ptolemaic crisis produced the three-language stone. The three-language stone survived for 2,000 years. The French expedition found it. The scholars decoded it. The ancient world came back. Chapter 4. The Canopus Decree and the Missing Pieces, the Rosetta Stone, is the most famous of the three-language decrees that the Ptolemaic priestly tradition produced. But it is not the only one, and understanding it in the context of the others is essential for understanding how the specific institution of the priestly decree worked and what the Memphis Decree was designed to accomplish. The Canopus Decree, issued in 238 BC during the reign of Ptolemy III Euergetes, is the most important comparative example. It was found at Tanis in the Egyptian Delta in 1866 CE by the German Egyptologist Carl Lepsius. Found, in fact, as a trilingual inscription in hieroglyphs, Demotic and Greek, just like the Rosetta Stone, and providing a second bilingual key that confirmed and extended Champollion's decipherment in specific details. The Canopus Decree is issued in a very different political context from the Memphis Decree. Ptolemy III was a capable ruler, and the decree was issued in a period of relative stability, a period when the priestly royal accommodation was functioning reasonably well, and the decree was more a celebration of the relationship than a crisis-driven attempt to rebuild it. The tone is different, more expansive, more focused on the dynasty's achievements, more confident about the future. The comparison between the Canopus Decree and the Memphis Decree. The comparison between the confident priestly celebration of a successful reign and the crisis-driven institutional accommodation of a reign that had barely begun under the worst possible circumstances is one of the most illuminating available windows into the specific nature of the Ptolemaic political situation in the 2nd century BC. The scholars who have worked most systematically on this comparison include Günther Hulb, whose History of the Ptolemaic Empire treats both decrees in detail, and Dorothy Thompson, whose specific analyses of the Memphis contexts illuminate the particular character of the 196 BC crisis. Both note the specific shift in tone between the two documents, the shift from celebration to repair, as the most direct available evidence for how the priestly tradition understood the specific character of Ptolemy V's political situation. Reading the two documents side by side, it is possible to see, in the specific language of the priestly tradition, the difference between a dynasty at its high point and a dynasty struggling to recover from its most severe internal crisis. The Canopus Decree speaks of what has been accomplished. The Memphis Decree speaks of what has been restored and what will be maintained going forward. The difference between accomplishment and restoration is the distance between the early and the middle Ptolemaic periods. The numbers are striking when placed in comparative context. Ptolemy III issued his decree at a point when the dynasty had been ruling Egypt for approximately 70 years and had produced 3 capable rulers in succession. Ptolemy V's Memphis Decree was issued at a point when the dynasty had just survived a decade of negligent governance, a predatory regency, the murder of the child king's mother, the loss of significant external territory. and the most serious internal revolts in the dynasty's history. 2 decrees, 2 contexts, 1 institutional tradition, 3,000 years deep, applying the same instrument to radically different circumstances, and doing so with the full intelligence that the tradition had accumulated across those 3,000 years. Chapter 5. The Boy King in full Ptolemy V Epiphanes, the God Manifest, the name by which he was known in his official titulary, is one of the more pitiable figures in the history of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and the pity is not the false pity of hindsight imposed on someone who would not have recognized it. The specific circumstances of his early life were, by any reasonable standard, extraordinary in their combination of power and vulnerability. He was approximately 5 years old when his father died, and the regency of Agathocles began. He was approximately 9 when the Alexandrian mob killed the regents, and he was carried through the streets in a celebration he was too young to understand. He was approximately 12 when the Roman Senate issued its formal recognition of his rule, a recognition prompted by the kingdom's urgent need for external legitimacy and the specific calculation of the Roman Senate that a Ptolemaic Egypt under Roman protection served Roman interests better than an Egypt absorbed by either Antiochus or Philip. He was approximately 13 or 14 when the Memphis coronation ceremony was performed, and the decree that became the Rosetta Stone was issued. At each of these moments, the child was both the formal centre of enormous political significance and the actual subject of decisions made by others. The Regency government had made decisions. The Alexandrian mob had made decisions. The Roman Senate had made decisions. The Memphis priests had made decisions. All of these decisions had been made nominally in the king's name and actually by the people with sufficient power and sufficient interest to make them. This is not unusual in the history of child rulers. What is unusual about Ptolemy V's specific case is the specific quality of the institutional intelligence that surrounded him during the crisis period. The quality of the priestly tradition's response, in particular, which demonstrated precisely the kind of long horizon thinking about the relationship between royal authority and native legitimacy that the crisis required. The ancient sources on Ptolemy V, primarily the Greek historian Polybius, who was writing in the mid-2nd century BC and had access to oral traditions and documentary sources from the period, present him as a ruler who, once he reached effective maturity, displayed a capacity for harsh, decisive action that was, in context, probably a product of his specific childhood circumstances as much as of any innate quality. A child who had survived the specific dangers of the Regency period, the murder of his mother, the killing of the regents, the constant surrounding presence of people whose loyalty was contingent on their calculations of advantage, would have developed a specific wariness about trust and a specific readiness for preemptive action that a more securely reared ruler might not have needed. The ancient accounts describe Ptolemy V's personal campaigns in Upper Egypt, where he participated directly in the suppression of the native revolts with a personal directness that suggests genuine military engagement rather than simply ceremonial presence. He was, by these accounts, a ruler who led from the front when the situation required it, a quality that was not irrelevant in a kingdom where the personal authority of the king was one of the primary instruments of governance. He died young, in approximately 180 BC, at the age of approximately 28, in circumstances that the ancient sources suggest may have involved poison. The specific details are uncertain, but the general pattern of Ptolemaic succession politics, which had already included the probable murder of his father and the definite murder of his mother, made an early and violent death not improbable for a Ptolemaic ruler who had accumulated enemies in the course of his reign. He left behind him 2 things. The dynasty, which continued for another century and a half, largely because the institutional accommodations that had been rebuilt during his reign provided a functional basis for the continued coexistence of the Greek ruling class and the native Egyptian population, and the stone, which would wait quietly in a medieval wall for 2,000 years, and then give the modern world back the ability to read everything that the civilization that had produced it had ever written. Chapter 6. The Rosetta Stone's journey from the priests of Memphis to the British Museum is itself one of the more eventful object histories in the history of the ancient world's physical remains. After it was inscribed in 196 BC and distributed to, presumably, the temple at Sai or the temple at Canopus, or another major sacred site in the Delta region. Its specific original location is uncertain. The stone was found at Rosetta, which is relatively close to several major ancient temple sites, but not itself the location of a famous ancient temple. The stone was presumably displayed in a publicly visible location for several centuries. It served its political function, announcing the accommodation, making the obligations visible. For as long as the Ptolemaic state remained functional enough for the announcement to have political relevance. After the Roman conquest of Egypt following Cleopatra's death in 30 BC, the political function of the decree was extinct. The Ptolemaic dynasty was over. The specific accommodation between the Greek ruling class and the Egyptian priestly tradition that the Memphis decree had been designed to maintain was replaced by the Roman administrative system, which had its own approaches to managing the Egyptian population. The stone remained where it was, a large piece of inscribed rock in or near a temple, no longer politically relevant but not actively removed. Somewhere in the subsequent centuries, the specific date is unknown, as is the specific mechanism. The stone was removed from its original location and incorporated into a building project. Medieval Egypt, like every historical period, used the materials available to it, and large blocks of inscribed stone from ancient temples were both plentiful and structurally useful. The stone ended up in the medieval fortification walls at Rosetta, at Fort Julia, where Bouchard found it in 1899. The British Museum received the stone in 1802 and has kept it since. There have been, since Egyptian independence and the growth of the repatriation movement in international cultural heritage politics, periodic requests from the Egyptian government for the stone's return. The British Museum has declined these requests, following the policy that most major Western museums have maintained regarding the ancient artifacts they hold, which is that the universal access provided by display in a major international museum serves the public interest better than repatriation to the country of origin. This is a genuine ethical debate with serious arguments on both sides, and this account does not take a position on it. What it does note is that the debate itself reflects the specific character of the stone's history, an object produced in a specific political context for a specific political purpose, removed from that context by the accidents of history found by the specific accident of a military engineering project, transferred by the specific outcome of a military conflict, and now housed in an institution whose own complex relationship with the ancient world it preserves is the product of specific historical circumstances that are themselves contested. The stone has always been political. It was political when the priests inscribed it. It is political now, in the debates about its custody. The politics have changed radically. The stone has not. Chapter 7. Reading it all. In the 2 centuries since Champollion's decipherment, the ability to read hieroglyphs has unlocked one of the most extraordinary documentary archives in the history of the ancient world. The sheer quantity of the material is difficult to convey. The Egyptian state maintained administrative records for 3,000 years. The temples accumulated religious texts for 3,000 years. Individual Egyptians wrote on papyri and pottery sherds and tomb walls, recording their transactions, their beliefs, their medical cases, their astronomical observations, their mathematical problems, their love affairs, their quarrels, and their deaths. All of this is now readable. The British Museum's collection of Egyptian papyri alone runs to tens of thousands of individual documents. The Berlin Papyrus Collection, the Turin Collection, the Louvre Collection, the Metropolitan Museum Collection. Each of these represents thousands of additional documents. The inscriptions in the major temple sites, Karnak, Luxor, Edfu, Dendera, Philae, and dozens of others, run to millions of individual hieroglyphic signs, recording religious texts, historical accounts, lists of offerings, royal annals, and the specific institutional records of the temple establishments across centuries of continuous operation. The specialist who has done more than almost any other single individual to make this material accessible to the modern world is the German Egyptologist Hans Werner Fischer-Elfert, whose work on the Egyptian medical and literary papyri has produced the most comprehensive modern understanding of what ancient Egyptian literature and medical practice actually contained. Fischer-Elfert's editions and analyses of specific papyrus collections have, over the course of a career, added substantially to the picture of ancient Egyptian intellectual life that the decipherment of the Rosetta Stone made possible. What the texts reveal, taken together, is a civilization of extraordinary depth and extraordinary breadth, a civilization that was not simply the producer of pyramids and colossal statues, but the producer of a literary tradition of genuine sophistication, a medical tradition of clinical precision, a mathematical tradition of practical effectiveness, and an administrative tradition of remarkable organizational sophistication. The decipherment of the Rosetta Stone was the key. The texts that the key unlocked are the civilization itself, speaking in its own voice. And all of this, all 3,000 years of it, was silent until a French officer found a stone in a wall and recognized that it was unusual. The recognition changed everything. The stone was the hinge. And the story of who made the stone, and why, and what was at stake when it was made. That is the story of Ptolemy V Epiphanes, the pharaoh of the Rosetta Stone, the child king in whose name the priests of Memphis inscribed one of the most consequential objects in the history of human civilization. His reign was troubled, his kingdom was shrinking, his dynasty would survive him by 150 years and then end, as the Ptolemaic dynasties had always threatened to end, with the specific combination of external pressure and internal failure that the Roman Empire's military superiority eventually made inevitable. But the stone was there, the stone survived, and the stone gave us everything. Chapter 8. The other Ptolemaic decrees. The Rosetta Stone is the most famous of the priestly decrees, but not the only one, and understanding the full range of these documents is essential for understanding what the Memphis priests were doing in 196 BC, and how their action fits into the broader institutional history of the Ptolemaic state. The earliest of the major priestly decrees that survive is the Alexandria Decree, issued in about 243 BC during the reign of Ptolemy III Euergetes. This decree is less well known than the Canopus decree that followed it, but it establishes the basic format that would be repeated across the subsequent examples. The priestly council assembled, the king's benefactions to the temples listed, the honours to the king enumerated in return, and the distribution of the text to the major temples in multiple scripts required. The Canopus decree of 238 BC, as discussed in the previous chapter, is the most important single comparative example for the Rosetta Stone. It was found at Tanis and has been studied as carefully as the Rosetta Stone itself, both for what it says and for what it reveals about the priestly royal accommodation in the early Ptolemaic period. After the Memphis decree of 196 BC, the Rosetta Stone, there are additional examples from later in the 2nd century BC that show the same institutional format being applied in progressively different political circumstances. The Phalensis decrees, the Memphis decree of 182 BC, and several other fragmentary examples all demonstrate that the format was maintained as a living institutional practice well into the 2nd century BC, adapting to the specific circumstances of each successive crisis or occasion. The scholar who has done the most systematic comparative analysis of all these decrees, examining them as a series of institutional documents rather than as individual artifacts, is the American papyrologist John Dillery, whose work on the Ptolemaic priestly tradition has produced the most comprehensive modern account of how the accommodation mechanism functioned across the entire dynasty. Dillery noted that the decrees form a series whose internal development reflects the changing political circumstances of the Ptolemaic state. Early decrees more expansive and celebratory, middle decrees more transactional and detailed in their enumeration of specific obligations, later decrees showing increasing specificity about particular grievances and particular remedies. This development mirrors the political trajectory that the previous sections of this account have described. The early dynasty was confident and expansive. The middle dynasty was managing the consequences of specific policy failures. The later dynasty was struggling to maintain the basic functional accommodation that the founding generation had built almost casually as the natural expression of the ruler's own cultural intelligence. The decrees record this trajectory in the specific language of the institutional tradition that was managing it. The Rosetta Stone occupies the specific inflection point in this trajectory. The moment when the confident expansion was clearly over, the specific crisis of the Regency had done its damage, and the institutional tradition was making its most urgent and most carefully designed attempt to rebuild what had been broken. It is the most politically urgent of all the surviving decrees, and its urgency is precisely what makes it the most illuminating window into the specific character of the Ptolemaic political crisis. Chapter 9. The Hieroglyphic Script and What Was Lost. The decipherment of the Rosetta Stone is often described as the recovery of hieroglyphics, as if the script had simply been misplaced and was now returned. This description is inaccurate in a specific way that matters. The hieroglyphic script was not simply lost and found. It was a living script that died, that contracted over several centuries from the primary formal writing system of a civilization to a specialized priestly knowledge maintained by an ever-diminishing community of practitioners, and that eventually ceased to be transmitted because the specific institutional context that had sustained the transmission was dissolved by the political and religious transformations of late antiquity. The specific mechanism of the script's death was the death of the institutions that had maintained it, the Egyptian temple establishments, the communities of priests who had been trained in hieroglyphic literacy as part of their religious education, who used hieroglyphs in their ritual practice, who carved hieroglyphic inscriptions as part of their architectural program, were the living carriers of the script. As these communities were progressively undermined by the specific economic and political pressures of the Roman and early Byzantine periods, the population of people who could read and write hieroglyphs contracted. When the last major temple establishments were closed by the Christian emperors in the 4th and 5th centuries CE, the temple of Isis at Philae was the last to be closed. In the early 6th century CE, the last institutional context for the transmission of hieroglyphic literacy was dissolved. The last hieroglyphic inscription, the one discussed in the previous accounts of this series, was carved at Philae on the 24th of August, 394 CE. The person who carved it knew that the tradition was ending. The inscription is, by the scholarly analysis of its content, a priestly farewell, a final act of the specific institutional practice that had been the vehicle for 3,000 years of Egyptian cultural expression. After that date, no new hieroglyphic inscriptions were carved, no new practitioners were trained. The specific chain of transmission that had run from master to student in the Egyptian priestly communities since the beginning of the Old Kingdom was broken. The writing system was preserved in the physical inscriptions that covered the temple walls and the papyri in the museum collections, but the knowledge of how to read it was gone, present but unreadable, silent for 1400 years. The Rosetta Stone was already in its medieval wall when the last hieroglyphic inscription was carved at Philae. It had been there for approximately 600 years. It would stay there for another 1400 years after the last priest who could read it died. And then Bouchard found it. And then Young and Champollion worked out what it said. And then the writing system was alive again. Not in the specific institutional form of the priestly tradition that had maintained it, not in the specific cultural context of the civilization that had created it, but in the scholarly tradition of modern Egyptology, which has read, analyzed, catalogued, translated, and published more hieroglyphic text in the 200 years since the decipherment than was read by all the Egyptian priests combined across the 3,000 years of the script's active use. The scale of the modern scholarly achievement that the decipherment made possible is, in its own way, extraordinary. Every hieroglyphic text that has been published and translated and made accessible to readers in the modern world, the pyramid texts, the Book of the Dead, The coffin text, the temple inscriptions, the administrative papyri, the literary compositions, the medical manuals, all of this became accessible because of the specific chain of events that began with the priestly crisis of 196 BC and ended with Champollion's announcement in 1822. 3,000 years of silence and then all of it at once. Let that sink in. The entire written record of one of the most ancient and most prolific civilizations in the history of the human world. 3,000 years of administrative records, religious texts, literary compositions, scientific documents, personal letters, love poetry, philosophical reflections, all of it silent for 1,400 years, and then all of it readable again. The Rosetta Stone was the key, and the story of who made the key and why is the story this account has been telling. Chapter 10. The Memphis Council and How It Worked. The priestly council at Memphis that issued the Rosetta Stone's decree was not an improvised gathering. It was a specific institutional form, the regular assembly of the chief priests of the major Egyptian cult centers, that had been functioning in various forms throughout the Ptolemaic period, and that represented the most important institutional mechanism for managing the relationship between the Greek ruling dynasty and the native Egyptian religious establishment. The mechanics of how such a council was organized and how it operated are known, in part, from the decrees themselves, which specify, in their opening sections, the composition of the assembly and the formal procedures followed, and in part from administrative papyri that describe related institutional processes. The assembly at Memphis, in 196 BC, would have brought together the high priests of the major cults from across the country. The priests of Ptah at Memphis, the priests of Amun at Thebes, the priests of Ra at Heliopolis, the priests of Osiris at Abydos, the priests of the major delta cults, and representatives of the smaller regional temples. These were not simply religious officials in the narrow modern sense. They were institutional leaders of extraordinary authority, the heads of organizations that controlled significant land holdings, maintained large communities of dependent workers and craftsmen, managed educational and medical institutions, supervised the agricultural management of their regions, and served as the primary points of contact between the native Egyptian population and the Ptolemaic administrative apparatus. The high priest of Ptah at Memphis was, in terms of institutional reach, a more significant figure in the daily lives of the native Egyptian population of the Memphis region than the Greek strategos, who nominally governed the same territory. The council's authority derived from this institutional weight. When the priests of Memphis issued a decree in the name of Ptolemy V, they were not simply bestowing divine approval on a politician. They were committing the institutional infrastructure of the entire Egyptian religious establishment to the specific obligations the decree recorded, committing to recognize and celebrate Ptolemy V as the legitimate pharaoh, to perform the specific honors enumerated in the decree, and to maintain the specific institutional relationship with the royal government that the decree described. This commitment had real content. The temples that the decree required to display the inscription would display it. The annual festivals it required to be celebrated would be celebrated. The prayers it required to be recited would be recited. The institutional machinery was real, the commitment was real, and the practical consequences of the commitment for the native population who participated in the temple rituals, who depended on the temple institutions, who organized their daily and seasonal and annual lives around the ritual calendar, were real. The stone was not simply a statement, it was a program. The priests were not simply recording what was. They were committing to do something specific, sustained, and institutionally grounded, that would, over time, rebuild the specific accommodation that the Regency years had damaged. The council understood what it was doing. 3,000 years of institutional practice had produced the specific intelligence required to do exactly this, at exactly this moment, and the stone they carved survived everything that followed. Chapter 11. The Demotic Text and What It Adds. The demotic text of the Rosetta Stone, the middle band of script, between the hieroglyphs above and the Greek below, is the least studied of the three registers by the general public and the least likely to be examined carefully, even by specialists who are not specifically trained in demotic. This is partly a function of the script's visual character, which is markedly less visually striking than the elegant hieroglyphs above it. Demotic is, by its nature, a cursive, abbreviated script designed for speed and practicality rather than visual impact, and partly a function of the scholarly tradition that has concentrated Egyptological energy more on the hieroglyphic and Greek texts. But the demotic text is, for the political history of the stone, in some ways the most important of the three. It is the text that was addressed to the native Egyptian population in the script of their everyday literacy, the script in which they read contracts, conducted business, and managed the administrative aspects of their lives. It is the text that made the decree available to the people whose cooperation was most immediately needed for the accommodation to work: the farmers, the craftsmen, the village communities, the local priests of the smaller cults, who would actually carry out the annual festivals and the specific ritual honors that the decree required. The demotic version of the decree is not a word-for-word translation of the Greek. It is an adaptation, a rendering of the same content in the specific linguistic and stylistic conventions of the demotic tradition, using the specific forms of address and the specific institutional language that the demotic reading population would have recognized as appropriate for a document of this type. The specific adaptations are visible to scholars who compare the two texts carefully, and they reveal the degree to which the priests were tailoring the message to each audience rather than simply producing mechanical translations. The specialist who has produced the most careful modern analysis of the demotic text is the Dutch Egyptologist Carol Andrews, whose work with the British Museum's holdings. The museum holds the Rosetta Stone and published the definitive technical edition of all three texts. Includes the most comprehensive available glossary and grammatical analysis of the demotic register. Andrews noted that the specific demotic vocabulary of the decree draws on a range of registers, formal priestly language, administrative terminology, and certain forms that seem to have been specifically designed for wide accessibility. That suggests the text was carefully composed for its specific audience rather than mechanically translated. This careful composition is itself evidence of the institutional intelligence that produced the stone. The priests were not just writing a text. They were writing three texts, each designed for its specific audience, each using the specific linguistic resources that would be most effective for that audience, and each conveying the same fundamental message: the accommodation, the obligations, the binding commitment, in the form most likely to be understood and most likely to produce the desired political effect. Three audiences, three compositions, one stone, one attempt to hold together a world that was fracturing. The stone held. The world eventually did not hold indefinitely, but it held long enough, and the stone gave us everything that the world had ever written. That is the story of the Rosetta Stone in its fullest available form. The following sections draw the implications and close the account. The Rosetta Stone sits in room 4 of the British Museum in London. Thousands of people walk past it every day. Most of them pause. Most of them look at it. Most of them know, in the broad outlines, that it was the key to deciphering hieroglyphics. Most of them take a photograph. Almost none of them know what the stone says. Almost none of them know that the stone is, at its core, a record of a deal struck between a child king who had survived multiple political catastrophes before he reached adolescence, and an ancient priestly tradition that was trying to hold a fracturing civilization together with the only tools it had. Almost none of them know that the three scripts inscribed on the stone were each designed for a specific audience, that the design was an act of institutional intelligence 3,000 years deep, that the stone was produced at the specific moment when the Ptolemaic dynasty's internal crisis was most acute, and the stakes of the accommodation it recorded were most existential. The deeper truth of the Rosetta Stone is not about the decipherment. The deeper truth is about what the stone was made for, by whom, and why. The Memphis priests of 196 BC were not making an object for posterity. They were not creating a linguistic artifact that would eventually help a French scholar in 1822 CE figure out what ancient Egyptian writing meant. They were doing what the priestly tradition had always done, using the specific institutional tools available to manage the relationship between the royal authority and the native population in the specific crisis conditions of their particular moment. The tool they used happened to be one that would survive for 2,000 years and then prove to be one of the most consequential discoveries in the history of scholarship. But the tool was not designed to be consequential for posterity. It was designed to be effective for the specific political crisis of 196 BC, to make the royal obligations public, binding, and unambiguous, to demonstrate to the native Egyptian population that the king recognized what had been broken and was committed to repairing it, to rebuild the institutional accommodation that the regency had damaged. The design was effective for its original purpose, in the sense that the accommodation was rebuilt, the native revolts eventually ended, and the Ptolemaic dynasty survived for another century and a half. The design was far more than effective in its unintended consequence. The stone survived, intact, in a wall for 2,000 years, and then gave the modern world back the ability to read everything that ancient Egypt had ever written. Let that sink in. The most consequential act of historical preservation in the entire history of Egyptology was performed unintentionally by a group of ancient priests who were trying to solve a political problem. They were not thinking about posterity. They were thinking about the specific crisis of their specific moment, and in solving their specific crisis, they produced the specific tool that posterity needed to hear the ancient world's voice again. This is the deeper truth about how civilizational knowledge gets preserved. It does not get preserved, primarily, through deliberate acts of archival ambition, through the systematic effort to collect and maintain knowledge for the benefit of future generations. It gets preserved through the specific accidents of the specific objects that survive, accidents that are shaped, in complex and only partially traceable ways, by the specific institutional practices of specific moments. The priestly tradition inscribed its political accommodation in hard stone and distributed it widely. The stone survived because stone is durable and because the specific accident of its incorporation into a medieval wall protected it from the specific pressures that destroyed more fragile materials. The modern world found it because a French engineering officer was working at a specific location at a specific moment and recognized that the inscribed stone in the wall was unusual. Change any one of these specific accidents, and the Rosetta stone does not exist in the way we know it. The priests use softer stone, or papyrus. The stone is removed from the wall before 1899. Bouchard does not recognize its significance. In any of these alternative histories, the decipherment might have been delayed for decades or centuries, or might have been achieved through other means, or might not have been achieved in its specific form. But these alternative histories did not occur. The specific combination of the priestly tradition's institutional practices, the physical durability of granodiorite, the specific accident of medieval reuse, and the specific moment of the French expedition's scholarly attention produced the specific outcome that gave the modern world back the voice of the ancient world. This is not science fiction. This is the contingent, accident-shaped reality of how historical knowledge is actually preserved and transmitted. The grand narratives of civilizational continuity, the stories in which knowledge passes smoothly from generation to generation through the deliberate efforts of wise preservers, are mostly retrospective constructions. The actual mechanism is more like the Rosetta Stone. Specific objects, specific accidents, specific moments of recognition, preserving specific things that happen to contain the specific keys needed for specific unlockings. The Memphis priests were wise. Their institutional tradition was deep. But they were not trying to preserve hieroglyphics for posterity. They were trying to hold their kingdom together. The preservation of hieroglyphics was the accidental consequence of their success in doing something else entirely. The deeper truth about Ptolemy V is the same truth in different form. He was not a great ruler in the conventional sense, not a military conqueror, not an administrative innovator, not a cultural patron of the scale of his great predecessors. He was a child who survived an impossible situation, a teenager who was crowned in the middle of a crisis, a young man who spent his reign trying to rebuild what the previous decade had damaged. He was the pharaoh of a decree, not the pharaoh of a triumph, but the decree survived, and the decree gave everything. The child king, who had barely survived to be crowned, was the nominal ruler of the civilization whose priestly tradition was 3,000 years deep. That tradition produced, in the specific crisis of his reign, the most consequential single inscription in the history of the study of the ancient world. He did not produce it. He did not design it. He did not understand, at 14 years old, what the stone that bore his name would eventually mean. But his name is on the stone. His crisis produced the stone. His priests wrote the stone. He is the pharaoh of the Rosetta Stone, and that connection between the child king in crisis and the object that gave the modern world back the voice of the ancient world is one of the most extraordinary connections in the history of civilization. The priests who wrote the stone understood their institutional tradition. They understood their political crisis. They used the tools available to them with extraordinary intelligence. And they created, as a consequence of their specifically targeted political act, something that no one involved in the creation could have anticipated or understood as the consequence of their act. This is, at its deepest level, what the story of Ptolemy V and the Rosetta Stone is about. Not the decipherment, however extraordinary, not the political crisis, however fascinating, the specific connection between an institutional act designed to solve a specific local problem and the global, permanent, 2,000-year consequence of that act. The connection is the deeper truth. The connection is why the stone matters. There is one more dimension of the deeper truth that this section must address, and it connects the story of the Rosetta Stone directly to the arc of this entire series. This series has traced the story of Egyptian civilization across the late period and into the Ptolemaic dynasty. From Psamtik I's restoration of native sovereignty in the 7th century BC to Ptolemy II's building of Alexandria's wonders in the 3rd. Along the way, it has been exploring a specific question that runs beneath all of the individual stories. How does civilizational knowledge survive the specific political crises and the specific institutional disruptions that regularly threaten the continuity of organized human life? The answer that the series has been building toward, story by story, is not the simple answer of deliberate archival preservation. It is the more complex and more realistic answer of specific institutional practices, specific physical objects, specific accidents of survival, and specific moments of recovery, the specific combination of the intentional and the accidental that actually governs the transmission of civilizational knowledge across time. The Rosetta Stone is the most perfect single example of this answer in the entire history of the ancient world. It was a deliberately made object, produced by a specific institutional tradition for a specific political purpose. It survived through a combination of physical durability, the accident of medieval reuse, and the specific fortune of being found at the right moment by the right people. And it produced, as the consequence of its survival, the specific enabling condition that allowed the modern world to read everything that ancient Egypt had ever written. The Memphis priests did their job, the stone did its job, and 3,000 years of human civilization in the Nile Valley spoke again. That speaking, the restored voice of ancient Egypt, available now to anyone who has the patience to learn the writing system that the Rosetta Stone unlocked, is the deepest consequence of everything this series has described. Not the military campaigns, the commercial empires, the diplomatic achievements, the cultural syntheses. All of those are important. All of them are part of the story. But the deepest consequence, the one that shapes the present most directly and most lastingly, is the restored voice. We can hear them now. The scribes and the priests, and the kings and the farmers and the merchants and the lovers and the grieving parents and the ambitious officials and the devout worshippers of 3,000 years of civilization in the Nile Valley. We can hear all of them, in their own words, Because a group of priests in Memphis in 196 BC inscribed a political decree in 3 scripts on a piece of hard stone. That is the full scope of the deeper truth, and it deserves the full scope of the recognition it has not yet received. The grief in this story is specific and irreducible. It is the grief of 1400 years of silence. 1400 years, during which the written record of one of the most ancient and most prolific civilizations in the history of the human world was present but unreadable, an archive of human experience that no living person could access. The texts were there, the objects were there, the temple walls were standing, covered in signs that carried meaning. But the meaning was locked, and the people who had held the key were gone. 1400 years is difficult to hold in mind as a genuine span of human time. It is not an abstraction. It is 70 generations of human beings, each of whom grew up, worked, loved, suffered, thought and died, without the ability to read what the civilization that preceded them had written. The Egyptian farmers who worked the land around the silent temples in the medieval period, who may have incorporated the Rosetta Stone itself into the wall at Fort Julian, did not know what the signs on the stone said. The medieval Arab scholars, who produced some of the most sophisticated intellectual achievements of the pre-modern world, worked in Egypt, saw hieroglyphic inscriptions on ancient monuments, and could not read them. The European travellers who came to Egypt beginning in the Renaissance and wrote accounts of the extraordinary monuments they saw could describe the signs but could not read them. The loss was real. The duration of the loss was real. And the silence that surrounded the ancient civilization's written record for those 1400 years was not simply an inconvenience for scholars. It was the specific erasure from human consciousness of the specific human experiences recorded in the silent texts, the erasing of the voices of 3,000 years of civilization from the accessible portion of the human past. The decipherment restored those voices. Not perfectly. There are still texts that are unclear, still aspects of the ancient language that are imperfectly understood, still debates about the translation of specific passages. But the restoration is genuine, and its consequence for our understanding of the ancient world is as close to a miraculous recovery as the history of human scholarship has produced. Let that sink in a second time. We have back what was lost for 1400 years. We can read the pyramid texts, the oldest surviving religious texts in the world. We can read the medical papyri that describe clinical procedures with a precision and a specificity that reflect 3,000 years of accumulated medical knowledge. We can read the love poetry, the administrative records, the mythological compositions, the mathematical treatises, the personal letters. We can hear, in their own words, the specific human beings who built the civilization that this series has been describing, the scribes who worked for Psamtik, the priests who served Nectanebo, the administrators who managed the Ptolemaic commercial empire. All of this came back because of the Rosetta Stone, and the Rosetta Stone exists because of the crisis of Ptolemy V. There is something that deserves to be said about the specific irony that the crisis produced the key. The Ptolemaic period was, in its arc from the founding vision of Ptolemy I to the dissolution of the dynasty with Cleopatra's death, a story of progressive institutional degradation, of the gradual erosion of the specific combination of administrative intelligence, cultural sensitivity, and genuine engagement with the Egyptian priestly tradition that had made the early Ptolemaic state extraordinary. The library declined. The administrative system was progressively hollowed out by the specific failures of successive generations of Ptolemaic rulers. The commercial empire contracted. The diplomatic position weakened. The dynasty survived, not because it was flourishing, but because it was small enough, and geographically defensible enough, and strategically important enough to Rome, that Rome chose to protect it rather than absorb it. In the middle of this long decline, at the specific inflection point when the decline had produced its most acute crisis, the crisis of the Regency and the native revolts, the institutional tradition that had been deepening and developing across 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization produced its most consequential document. The crisis produced the key. The institutional wisdom of the 3,000-year tradition was deployed with maximum effectiveness at exactly the moment when the political failure of the Greek ruling dynasty had made it most necessary. The native tradition did not simply survive the Ptolemaic decline. It produced, in the specific conditions that the decline created, the object that would give the modern world back everything the tradition had ever written. This is the specific form that the grief takes in the story of Ptolemy V and the Rosetta Stone. Not the grief of an ending, though the dynasty was in decline and the ending was approaching. Not the grief of a loss, though the specific crisis had been a genuine loss, and the damage done by the Regency years was real. The grief is the grief of a civilization that was running out of time but still producing, in its diminishment, objects of extraordinary consequence, objects that would do more for the civilization's legacy than anything produced during its most expansive and most confident period. The Rosetta Stone is more consequential than the Library of Alexandria. The library was extraordinary, and what it produced shaped the ancient world in ways that this series has traced in detail. But the library is gone, the stone is still here, and the stone gave us back not just the library, but everything that the civilization that built the library had ever written, in every context, on every medium, across 3,000 years. The diminished Ptolemaic state of the 2nd century BC, struggling with native revolts and the loss of Coel Syria, and the degraded administrative machinery of the post-Regency period, produced the most consequential single piece of the civilization's intellectual legacy. The decline produced the key. This is the deepest truth of the story, and it is a truth about how civilizations work, how the specific knowledge and the specific institutional intelligence that civilizations develop across centuries can produce their most lasting contributions in the specific conditions of their own crisis, when the ordinary resources are depleted and the specific tools of the deep tradition are the only tools left. The Memphis priests had no other tools. They had the institutional tradition. They used it, and they created something that gave the world everything. That is the deeper truth, and it deserves to be held in mind as the account moves to its close. There is a specific element of the deeper truth that has not yet been named directly, and it concerns the modern observer's relationship to the ancient world that the Rosetta Stone restored. We know things about ancient Egypt that no one in Europe or the wider world outside the Egyptian specialist tradition knew for 1400 years. We know the names of individual scribes, the contents of individual letters, the specific details of individual medical cases, the precise astronomical observations of individual Egyptian observers, the exact wording of individual love poems written by people who died 3,000 years ago. We know these things because the Rosetta Stone was found, and because the scholars who studied it worked out what it meant, and because the generations of Egyptologists who followed Champollion have spent 2 centuries reading, publishing, and making accessible the texts that the decipherment unlocked. This knowledge is not simply historical, it is, in a specific and genuine sense, personal. The Egyptian man who wrote a letter to his brother asking him to send grain. The Egyptian woman who wrote a will, leaving her property to her children. The Egyptian physician who recorded the symptoms and the treatment and the outcome of a patient's illness. The Egyptian scribe who copied a love poem in his best handwriting on a piece of good papyrus. These are specific human beings, specific lives, specific moments of experience that are now accessible to us in ways that would not have been possible without the Rosetta Stone. The stone gave us people, not abstractions, not civilizations in the aggregate, but specific people with specific voices, saying specific things in their own words. This is the gift that the Memphis priests inadvertently gave to the modern world. They were trying to hold their kingdom together. They gave us back the people of 3,000 years of a kingdom that no longer exists. The grief of the silence, 1,400 years of those voices being inaccessible, is matched by the joy of their restoration. Not equally, and not simply, but matched. We have back what was lost. The voices speak. That is the deepest truth of all. The specific people that we can now hear, because of the Rosetta Stone, because of the Memphis priests' institutional intelligence, because of the specific accident of the stone's survival, and the specific brilliance of the scholars who decoded it, were not extraordinary people in most cases. They were ordinary people living ordinary lives in one of the most ancient and most complex civilizations the world has ever produced. They farmed, they traded, they prayed, they loved, they grieved. They recorded their transactions and their medical cases and their property disputes and their theological reflections in the specific writing system that their civilization had developed, and those records survived in the specific physical materials that their civilization used. The extraordinary people are in the records too, the pharaohs and the priests and the generals and the scholars. Their voices are in the texts as well, and their voices carry the specific weight of their specific positions and their specific historical consequences. But the ordinary people are the ones who give the civilization its full humanity. The love poem on the good papyrus, the letter asking for grain, the will leaving property to the children. These are the voices that the Rosetta Stone gave back most completely, because they are the voices that were most numerous and most present in the documentary record. The voices of people who were simply living in a civilization and leaving the traces of their living in the texts that their civilization's writing system made possible. We can hear them now. We have them back. 3,000 years of specific human lives, preserved in specific physical media, unlocked by a specific political document that survived specific accidents across 2,000 years, and then gave a specific scholar the specific insight that unlocked the entire system. The chain of specific accidents that leads from the Memphis priests of 196 BC to the love poem on the good papyrus is one of the most extraordinary chains in the history of human knowledge. Every link in the chain was necessary. None of them was inevitable. All of them happened. The stone is in room 4 of the British Museum. The love poems are in scholarly editions. The civilization speaks. Ptolemy V Epiphanes was the pharaoh whose name is on the stone. He did not make it possible, but his crisis produced it, and his name deserves to be known. Step back from the specific story of Ptolemy V and the Rosetta Stone and look at the broader pattern that this account and this entire series has been building toward. The series began with Psamtik I, who rebuilt Egyptian sovereignty from the wreckage of Assyrian occupation through institutional intelligence, patient alliance building, and genuine engagement with the priestly tradition that was the backbone of native Egyptian legitimacy. It continued through Necho's outward ambition, Amasis's commercial synthesis, Nectanebo's sustained building, Ptolemy I's founding vision, Ptolemy II's civilizational peak, and now it arrives at Ptolemy V, in whose reign the slow decline of the Ptolemaic state produced its most extraordinary unintended consequence. The trajectory is a long arc from restoration to peak to decline, but the arc is not simply about the political fortunes of a dynasty. It is about the relationship between institutional wisdom and political crisis. The specific way that the deepest available institutional intelligence tends to be deployed most effectively precisely in the conditions of greatest crisis, when the ordinary resources have been depleted and the specific tools of the ancient tradition are the only tools left. Psamtik used the priestly tradition's institutional wisdom to rebuild Egyptian sovereignty. The Ptolemies used it to legitimize a foreign dynasty. And in the crisis of the 2nd century BC, the priestly tradition used its deepest institutional tools, the 3-script stone, the formal commitment, the public binding, to hold together a kingdom that everything in its recent history suggested was about to fracture permanently. It worked partially. The kingdom survived. The dynasty continued for another century and a half, and the stone the priests carved survived for another 2,000 years after that. The implication that runs most directly from this pattern to the present is about the specific relationship between institutional wisdom and institutional crisis. Institutions, the specific organized communities of practice that carry civilizational knowledge and sustain civilizational functions across the disruptions of political and military history, are most valuable precisely when they are most stressed. The Egyptian priestly tradition was most valuable to the Ptolemaic state, not when the state was prosperous and confident, but when it was fractured and desperate. The specific institutional wisdom that the tradition had accumulated across 3,000 years was most consequentially deployed not in the conditions of the early Ptolemaic expansion, but in the crisis of the Regency years and its aftermath. This is counterintuitive in a specific way that modern thinking tends to undervalue. We tend to assume that institutions are most valuable when they are most functional, when their processes are running smoothly, their resources are adequate, and their leadership is competent. And this is true in the narrow sense of daily operational effectiveness. But the deeper value of institutions, the value that is most consequential across long time scales, is their capacity to respond intelligently to crisis, to deploy the accumulated wisdom of long institutional practice in the specific conditions of disruption, to find solutions that the short-term thinking of the political actors in crisis cannot generate on their own. The Memphis priests of 196 BC did not need to invent the three-script stone. They had the institutional tradition. The format of the decree was established. The practice of issuing priestly endorsements in multiple scripts for maximum reach was established. The specific language of the accommodation, the enumeration of royal benefits to the temples, the reciprocal bestowal of priestly honors on the king, was established. All they needed to do was apply the established institutional wisdom to the specific conditions of the specific crisis. That application was itself an act of intelligence. Not every crisis is responded to with the right institutional tool. Not every priestly tradition recognizes the specific moment when its deepest resources need to be deployed. Not every institutional community has the coherence and the self-awareness to produce, under the pressures of crisis, the specific response that the crisis requires. The Memphis priests had all of these things. 3,000 years of institutional development had produced a tradition capable of the specific act of institutional wisdom that the crisis required. The Rosetta Stone is the evidence that the tradition worked. The second implication is about how we evaluate historical legacies. The Ptolemaic dynasty is conventionally assessed primarily in terms of its political and military history. The territorial extent of the kingdom, the outcomes of the Syrian wars, the progressive shrinkage of Ptolemaic power in the 2nd century BC. This assessment is accurate but incomplete in a specific way. The most consequential legacy of the Ptolemaic period is not its military or political achievements. It is the Rosetta Stone. And the Rosetta Stone was produced not at the height of Ptolemaic power, not by Ptolemy I or Ptolemy II, who were the most consequential builders of the dynasty, but in the specific conditions of its most acute internal crisis, under the reign of a child king whose political situation was as bad as any in the dynasty's history. This is an extreme example of a general pattern. The most consequential legacies of historical periods are not always produced by the most powerful or the most capable actors at the moment of their greatest strength. They are produced by the specific combination of the institutional traditions that were available, the specific conditions that the moment created, and the specific accidents of physical survival that determined what reached posterity and what did not. Evaluating historical legacies requires attending to this combination. The political history of the Ptolemaic dynasty, important as it is not the whole of the dynasty's significance. The Rosetta Stone is the whole of the dynasty's significance in a certain specific sense. It is the part of the dynasty's history that changed the world most completely and most permanently, and it is the part that was produced in the least politically impressive circumstances of the dynasty's entire existence. The third implication connects the story of the Rosetta Stone to the question that this entire series has been approaching from multiple directions, the question of how civilizational knowledge survives. The series has examined many specific mechanisms of survival. Psamtik the first restoration of the priestly tradition and the administrative apparatus that sustained it. Ptolemy I's founding of the Library of Alexandria and the institutional conditions that made scholarly transmission possible. Ptolemy II's development of the library to its greatest scope, creating the canonical textual traditions that shaped everything that followed. Nectanebo II's building program, which produced the specific temples within which the hieroglyphic tradition continued for several more centuries. All of these were deliberate acts of institutional investment and deliberate acts of cultural preservation. They worked in the sense that the specific knowledge they were designed to preserve was preserved, at least partially, for a significant period of time. But the Rosetta Stone was not a deliberate act of cultural preservation. It was an act of political crisis management. It preserved the knowledge of the three-script inscription system, and thereby preserved the key to unlocking everything else as an accidental consequence of its primary purpose. This suggests a more complex picture of how civilizational knowledge survives than the simple narrative of deliberate preservation implies. Knowledge is preserved partly by deliberate institutional investment, but it is also preserved by the specific physical durability of the objects that carry it. Granite outlasts papyrus, and by the specific accidents of the object's subsequent histories. This stone ended up in a medieval wall, which protected it from the specific deterioration that destroyed more exposed objects, and it is preserved by the specific moments of recovery that the accidents eventually make possible. A French officer with enough scholarly awareness to recognize that the inscribed stone was unusual. We cannot rely on any single one of these mechanisms. We cannot simply invest in archives and assume the archives will survive. We cannot simply build in stone and assume the stone will endure. We cannot simply rely on chance accidents of recovery to give us back what we failed to deliberately preserve. What we can do, what the evidence of the Rosetta Stone most directly suggests, is invest in the institutional traditions that produce the specific kinds of deep wisdom that can respond effectively to crisis. The Memphis priests' ability to produce the three-script stone at the right moment was not a function of their archival practices or their building materials or the accidental survival of the stone. It was a function of the institutional depth that allowed them to recognize what the moment required and produce the appropriate response with the full weight of the tradition behind it. That institutional depth, the specific kind of accumulated wisdom that 3,000 years of continuous institutional practice produces, is the most durable and the most consequential form of civilizational preservation, and it is the form that the story of Ptolemy V and the Rosetta Stone most directly illuminates. The Memphis priests preserved the key to 3,000 years of Egyptian writing by solving a political problem. The institutional wisdom that allowed them to solve the political problem was itself the product of 3,000 years of accumulated practice. The civilization preserved itself in its most consequential act of preservation by deploying the accumulated wisdom of its own longest-running institutions in the specific conditions of its most acute crisis. This is the implication for the present, and this is the reflection with which this section ends. The stone is in the British Museum. The voices speak. The ancient world is accessible to anyone with the patience to learn the writing system that the Rosetta Stone unlocked, and the child king whose crisis produced the stone is the pharaoh whose name deserves to be remembered for the most consequential single object in the history of the ancient world. His name was Ptolemy V Epiphanes. His crisis produced the Rosetta Stone, and the Rosetta Stone gave us everything. There is one last observation that this reflection should include, and it concerns the specific position of the account within the series that has preceded it. This series has traced the arc of Egyptian civilization from Psamtik I through the Ptolemaic period, watching as the civilization's deepest institutional traditions navigated a series of political crises and transformations: the Assyrian occupation, the Restoration, the Persian conquests, the Macedonian succession, the Ptolemaic synthesis. At each stage, the same pattern has recurred. The political form changes, sometimes catastrophically, but the institutional substrate persists, adapting and continuing and deploying its accumulated wisdom in the specific conditions of each new crisis. Ptolemy V's reign is the clearest single example of this pattern in the entire series. The political circumstances were as bad as they had been at any point since the Assyrian occupation of the 7th century BC, and yet the institutional tradition produced, in response to those circumstances, the most consequential single document in the history of the ancient world's reception by posterity. The institutional substrate did not simply survive. It demonstrated, at the moment of its greatest stress, the specific consequence of the depth that 3,000 years of continuous practice had produced. The full arc is now visible. From Psamtik's restoration to Ptolemy V's crisis, the thread of institutional wisdom runs continuous and productive, most consequential, in the conditions of greatest stress. The thread did not break at the Rosetta Stone. It was inscribed in the Rosetta Stone, and the stone carried it forward in silence for 2,000 years until the modern world was ready to receive it. The arc is complete, the silence ends, the voices speak. This is the full scope of the implication. This is what the Rosetta Stone means, when it is understood not just as a linguistic artifact, but as a historical one, as the specific product of a specific crisis, a specific institutional tradition, and a specific chain of accidents that together produced the most consequential act of civilizational preservation in the history of the ancient world. The stone is the meaning is the stone. Room 4 of the British Museum. Any day, any hour the museum is open, there is always a crowd around it. The grey-black slab of granodiorite in its specially designed mount, surrounded by people who have come from every part of the world to stand before it for a moment and take a photograph. Most of them look at it for less than a minute. Most of them move on. The stone stands in its mount and does not notice. It has been standing in various configurations for more than 2,000 years. It stood in a temple somewhere in the Delta, while the Ptolemaic dynasty completed its slow decline and fell to Rome in 30 BC. It stood, in whatever form of informal display, through the Roman period and the early Christian period. It was incorporated into a medieval wall and stood there, a piece of structural material, unread and unremarkable, for more than 1,000 years. It was uncovered in 1899 and recognised and carried to Egypt and to London, and installed in the British Museum and has stood there ever since. 2,000 years. The stone has been standing for 2,000 years since the priests of Memphis carved it, and the people who walk past it in room 4 are the latest in an unbroken line of people who have stood near this stone, most of them without knowing what it says. The answer to the title question, who was Ptolemy V Epiphanes, the pharaoh of the Rosetta Stone, is now as complete as this account can make it. He was born approximately in 210 BC, the son of Ptolemy IV Philopator and Arsinoe III. He came to the throne at approximately 5 years old when his father died in 204 BC. His mother was murdered by the regency government of Agathocles and Agathoclea that controlled the kingdom for the first 4 years of his reign. He was approximately 9 when the Alexandrian mob killed the regents and the regency ended. He was formally crowned at Memphis in approximately 197 BC in the traditional Egyptian ceremony that the Ptolemaic dynasty had maintained since its founding as the primary mechanisms of its legitimacy with the native Egyptian population. In 196 BC, 1 year after his coronation, the priests of Memphis assembled in council and issued the decree that became the Rosetta Stone, a 3-script inscription in hieroglyphs, in Demotic and in Greek, that recorded the specific benefits that Ptolemy V had conferred on the temples and the specific honours that the priests were conferring on the king in return. The decree was distributed to temples across Egypt, carved on stones of hard material and displayed in publicly visible locations, as a formal, binding, public commitment of both the king and the priests to the terms of the accommodation it described. The decree was an attempt to rebuild the priestly royal accommodation that the regency years had damaged. The accommodation, over the following 2 decades, was rebuilt. The native revolts that had begun under the regency were eventually suppressed. The last counter-pharaoh in the Theban region was removed approximately 186 BC, and functional Ptolemaic authority was restored across the full length of the Nile Valley. Ptolemy V died in approximately 180 BC, at approximately 28 or 29 years old, in circumstances that the ancient sources suggest may have involved poison. He left behind him a dynasty that would continue for another century and a half, and a stone that would become the most consequential archaeological discovery in the history of the study of the ancient world. He did not know the stone would be consequential. He did not know it would be found in a wall 2,000 years after the priests carved it. He did not know that it would give the modern world back the ability to read everything that the civilization that produced it had ever written. He was a child king in a kingdom in crisis, trying to survive and to govern with the tools available to him and the institutional wisdom of the tradition that surrounded him. The stone was one of those tools. The priests who made it understood what they were making. He knew at 14 that the stone was important, that the ceremony mattered, that the accommodation was necessary, that the formal commitment represented in the stone was the institutional mechanism through which the damage of the Regency years could begin to be repaired. He did not know that the stone would become the Rosetta Stone. He did not know that Champollion would look at it in 1822 and shout that he had found it and then faint. He did not know that the 3 scripts the priests had inscribed with such institutional intelligence would become, 2,000 years later, the specific key that unlocked everything. He knew the stone mattered in 196 BC. He did not know how much it would matter in 1822 CE. The priests knew in one specific sense that the stone should last. They chose granodiorite, one of the hardest available stones, more durable than sandstone or limestone, capable of surviving the specific physical stresses of Egyptian climate and the specific accidents of Egyptian history. They chose the material that would last. They did not know how long it would need to last. They built for durability without knowing the scale of the durability required. 2,095 years. That is how long it lasted from the carving to the discovery. The priests who chose the stone chose well. The material was adequate to the task, and the task, which they could not have imagined when they chose the material, turned out to require exactly the durability that granodiorite could provide. The decipherment changed the world. 2 centuries of Egyptological scholarship have given the modern world back 3,000 years of human voices from the Nile Valley. Every hieroglyphic text that has been published and translated since Champollion's breakthrough, every religious composition, every administrative record, every personal letter, every love poem, every medical treatise, represents a voice returned to audibility by the specific chain of events that began with the Memphis priests' political crisis management in 196 BC, the specific voice of Ptolemy V himself. The child king whose crisis produced the stone is not heard in any direct personal record. The ancient sources record his actions, not his words. The papyri and inscriptions that survive from his reign are institutional documents, administrative records, priestly decrees, temple inscriptions that speak in the formal language of pharaonic tradition, rather than in the personal language of an individual human being. But the stone is his monument, not because he built it, the priests built it, but because his name is on it, his crisis produced it, and his civilization's most ancient institutional tradition deployed its deep wisdom on his behalf at the specific moment when the deployment was most needed. The stone is in room 4. The crowd moves around it. The photographs are taken. The crowd moves on. The stone stands. It has been standing for more than 2,000 years. It will stand for more. And everything it gave back, the voices of 3,000 years of civilization, speaking in their own words, recorded in the writing system that the stone unlocked, is available now to anyone who has the patience to listen. Look at the stone, the grey-black granite, the 3 bands of text, the chip at the top right corner where a piece broke off before it was found, the smooth face where the inscriptions are cut, the specific weight and heft of a piece of stone that was chosen for its durability by people who understood they were making something that needed to last, without knowing how long the lasting would need to be. The priests understood their institutional tradition. The tradition understood the crisis. The stone recorded the response. The stone survived. And the civilization that produced it, the civilization that built the pyramids and the Library of Alexandria and the Pharos lighthouse and the Canopus decree and the Apis bull stele and the love, poems on the good papyrus, speaks again. His name was Ptolemy V. He was the pharaoh of the Rosetta Stone. He did not choose to be the pharaoh of the Rosetta Stone. He was born into it, grew up inside it, survived it, and died without knowing what the stone his priests had carved would eventually mean to the world that received it. the accidental pharaoh of the most consequential accident in the history of ancient scholarship. The accident was real, the consequence was real, the stone is real, and now you know what that means.